My wife found Site 14 the way she finds everything she wants methodically, without compromise, cross-referencing the reservation map against satellite imagery until she'd identified the one site in the entire Daniel Boone National Forest campground system that met every condition on her list. Backed against a ridge, end of a spur road, no neighboring sites within comfortable earshot, the kind of place that would be dark by 3 in the afternoon and quiet by 4, the mountain cutting off the light early and the isolation doing the rest. She booked it for 4 nights without hesitation, and when I looked over her shoulder at the satellite image, I understood immediately why she'd chosen it. The site was pressed into the base of a ridge so steep and heavily timbered that it barely registered as a clearing at all from above, just a small interruption in the canopy at the end of a pale gravel line, the kind of place that would feel less like camping and more like being swallowed by the mountain. We drove up from Lexington on a Thursday in early September. The campground was in the eastern section of the forest, accessible by a county road that wound through second-growth hardwood for several miles before the entrance appeared. The camp host was a retired man named Gerald, who ran the loop from a large fifth wheel at the entrance, and he checked us in efficiently and pointed us toward the spur without comment. We followed the gravel past the main loop sites, past the point where the road curved and the other sites disappeared from view, and came to the end of the spur, where Site 14 waited in the shadow of the ridge. It was exactly what she'd wanted. A wooden tent platform centered in a clearing of perhaps 40 feet across, pressure-treated lumber on a frame of 4x4 posts that held the surface 8 inches off the ground, a fieldstone fire ring, a metal food storage box on a post at the clearing's edge. The ridge rising directly behind, not gradually, not with the gentle slope of most Appalachian terrain, but steeply, immediately, the ground going nearly vertical within 20 feet of the platform's back edge. The trees on the slope were old and close together, and the canopy they made overhead was dense enough that almost no direct sky was visible. Standing in the clearing felt like standing at the bottom of a well, enclosed, held. We set up the way we always do, dividing the work without discussing it, and by the time the light was failing, we had a fire going and dinner cooking and the site arranged exactly as we liked it. I remember being pleased with the place. I remember thinking that she'd been right about it, that the particular quality of isolation she'd been looking for was present in full: the early dark, the muffled quiet, the sense that the rest of the world had receded to a distance that was genuinely restful rather than merely notional. We ate and talked and let the fire settle and went to sleep before 10. The first night passed without incident. The second night passed without incident. I slept well on both nights, which I note because it is not typical for me. I am a light sleeper in unfamiliar places, the kind of person who spends the first night cataloging ambient sounds and waking at anything that doesn't fit the established pattern. At Site 14, I slept deeply and without interruption, which I filed away as a function of the physical exhaustion from the hiking, and thought nothing more about until later, when I had reason to reconsider it. On the morning of the third day, I was breaking down the tent to reseal the fly seams, a maintenance task I'd been deferring for months. In the process of pulling the stakes, I set my stake driver on the edge of the platform and watched it slide through the gap between the deck boards and disappear into the space beneath. The stake driver was a $40 aluminum tool I'd owned for 6 years and was not leaving without, so I got down on my stomach at the platform's edge and pushed my head and shoulders into the crawl space beneath. The space was 8 inches high and roughly the footprint of the platform, maybe 12 feet by 10. The light was poor. What came through the gaps in the deck boards above was thin and indirect, more orientation than illumination. I had my phone in my hand, and I turned on the flashlight and swept it toward where I'd heard the tool land. I found the stake driver. I also found what was beneath the center of the platform, and the finding of it displaced everything else so completely that I lay there on my stomach in the dirt for a long moment before I reached for anything. The depression was directly beneath the center of the platform, positioned, I thought later with a quality of understanding I was not immediately ready to act on, directly beneath where our sleeping pads had been laid for 2 nights. It was roughly circular, perhaps 4 feet across, and its defining characteristic was the smoothness of its surface. The soil was packed into a concave shape, a shallow bowl pressed into the earth, and the surface of it had the compacted density that ground acquires when something of significant weight returns to it repeatedly over a long period of time. I have seen this before in deer bedding areas and bear wallows, the way repeated occupancy reduces soil to a particular packed fineness, the surface almost polished in quality, every grain of loose material long since displaced. This looked like those things. It looked like a bed that had been used many times by something heavy enough to press the earth into a memory of its shape. Around the depression and along the platform supports, objects, a section of deer jaw, the teeth still seated in the bone, pressed into the soil at the depression's upper edge, a rusted tin container wedged between a support post and a crossbeam, the lid crimped shut, the metal corroded past any legibility. Several lengths of cordage coiled on a flat stone, hand-twisted from plant fiber, each piece consistent with the others in technique and tension, the work of someone who had done this many times and knew the method. And against the base of the platform on the ridge-facing side, arranged along the back edge of the depression, fabric, several sections of it, cut or torn from what had once been garments, the material old in a way that expressed itself as texture rather than color, a coarseness, a density of weave that didn't correspond to anything manufactured recently. The sections had been folded, each one individually, with care, the folds maintained, the sections stacked against the platform base in a way that was clearly intentional, not dropped, not discarded, stored, kept in a specific place within a specific space, in the way that a person keeps the things they intend to return to. I became aware of the warmth gradually, the way you become aware of something that is present before you've consciously registered it. My forearm, resting on the ground as I leaned forward to look, was registering heat from the surface of the depression. Not from any sun, the site was in full shade, and had been since before I'd started breaking down the tent. The warmth was coming from the soil itself, from the packed surface of the depression, and it was the warmth of a space that has been recently and continuously occupied by something that generates body heat, not residual warmth from yesterday. The kind of warmth that fades within an hour or two of departure. The kind that means the thing that made the space was not long gone. I picked up the stake driver. I pushed myself back out from under the platform and stood in the clearing and looked at the platform on which I had been sleeping for 2 nights and understood, with a completeness that did not leave room for the usual work of rationalization, what I was looking at. I did not go back under. I broke down the tent in silence. My wife was filtering water at the edge of the clearing and assumed from my pace that I wanted an early start on the trail. I loaded the car with the same systematic efficiency I always bring to camp breakdown, moving faster than usual without explaining why, not looking at the platform once the tent was off it. We were loaded and moving in under 40 minutes. When we reached Gerald's site at the campground entrance, I pulled over and asked him about Site 14. I asked if there had been any issues with it, any history he was aware of. And I watched his face perform a specific and careful adjustment, not surprise, not alarm, but the expression of a person deciding in real time what version of the truth to offer. He told me the site had been closed twice in the past 4 years. He said it had been for animal activity. He said those 2 words looking at a point past my left shoulder, and he did not ask what I'd found, which is what a person asks when they don't already have a reasonable sense of the answer. I asked what kind of animal. He said he didn't have those details. It was before his time at this campground. He only knew what the previous host's notes said. His eyes moved back to mine for a moment, and then away again. I thanked him, and we drove out to the county road. I told my wife everything before we reached the highway. I told it plainly, in order, without editorializing. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked the question I'd been holding since I'd pulled myself back out from under the platform. How warm, exactly? Warm enough that I noticed it immediately. Warm enough to register as anomalous against my forearm in 58-degree shade before I'd consciously identified it as warmth at all. Warm in the specific way of a space that has been occupied within the last hour. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, very quietly, that we had been sleeping 8 inches above it for 2 nights. I said I knew. She asked if I thought it had been there while we were sleeping. I didn't answer that directly. What I said instead was that I had slept unusually well on both nights, better than I typically sleep in unfamiliar places, and that I didn't know what to make of that. She didn't say anything to that either. We drove the rest of the way to the highway without talking, and then drove most of the way home without talking, And the silence between us was not uncomfortable exactly, but had a weight to it. The weight of something neither of us was ready to put into words. 3 weeks later, I called the Forest Service District Office and asked about the closure history for Site 14. The recreation technician who pulled the records was thorough and patient. She found 2 temporary closures, the dates matching what Gerald had described. Both were listed as precautionary closures pending wildlife assessment. Neither had an assessment document attached to the closure record in the system she could access. Both had lasted approximately 2 weeks before the site was returned to service. She could not tell me what species had prompted the closures, because the original notation said only unspecified wildlife sign. She said the absence of species documentation was, in her words, probably just an oversight. I've thought about the folded clothing more than anything else from that site. The depression I can process as evidence of habitation, something returning to the same place, pressing a memory of itself into the earth. The objects I can process as accumulation, the gathered materials of a life arranged in a particular way. The warmth I can process as proximity, as a narrowness of margin between our presence and whatever shares that space. All of those things speak to the fact of another occupant and to how recently that occupant had been present. The folded clothing speaks to something else. The folded clothing speaks to a person who maintains habits regardless of circumstance, who keeps things a certain way because that is how things are kept, because the practice of keeping them that way has outlasted whatever context originally produced it, who returns to the same location under the same structure with enough regularity and enough continuity of self that the act of folding and placing persists, that the space has been organized and maintained with a domestic consistency, that the surface circumstances, the dirt, the darkness, the 8-inch clearance, the deer jaw, the rusted tin do nothing to diminish. We had been sleeping above it for 2 nights. The platform boards between us and the depression were 1.5 inches of pressure-treated lumber. Whatever had been warm enough to heat the soil to a detectable temperature at 58 degrees in full shade had been there recently enough that the warmth hadn't dissipated in the time between its departure and my arrival. With my hand on the ground above its bed, Site 14 is still in the reservation system. I checked last month. It's available most weekends in October. The listing doesn't mention any history of closure. The reviews from recent campers mention the quiet, the early dark, the unusual sense of enclosure the ridge creates, the quality of sleep. I have not been able to bring myself to leave a review. I don't know what I would say that would be both honest and useful. I don't know how to describe what I found in a way that would communicate its full weight without sounding like something other than what it was: a warm depression in the earth, some folded cloth, a few objects arranged with intention, beneath a platform where my wife and I had been sleeping without disturbance for 2 nights, in a quiet that I now understand may not have been only the product of isolation. I still don't know what was there. I know what it had made. I know how recently it had been in it. I know that it came back to that place with enough regularity that the ground remembered it. I know that whatever it was, it had folded its clothes before it left. That last detail is the one I can't put down. Not the warmth, not the proximity, not the 2 nights of sleep I now read differently in retrospect. The folding, the careful, habitual, entirely unnecessary folding of fabric that had no practical reason to be folded, except that folding is what you do. That a person who folds things folds them because that is what a person does, because the practice of it means something, even when the context that taught it is long gone. I don't go back to that part of the forest anymore. My wife hasn't suggested it. Neither of us has said explicitly that we won't. It's just a thing we've quietly agreed to, without the agreement ever being spoken. The way you agree to certain things when speaking them out loud would require you to fully inhabit a conclusion you're not yet ready to live inside of. The Buffalo River in September is one of the most beautiful stretches of moving water in the American interior, and I say that as someone who has paddled rivers in 6 states and has strong opinions about what beautiful means when applied to moving water. It isn't dramatic beauty, it isn't the scale of the Colorado or the violence of a Class 4 drop. It's the other kind, the kind that accumulates slowly over hours of floating, the kind built from limestone bluffs, rising 100 feet from the water's edge, and clear green pools, so still between the riffles that you can see the gravel bottom in 8 feet of water and count the individual stones. the kind of beauty that requires silence and patience to receive properly, which is why I prefer to float it alone and why I'd planned this particular trip for September rather than summer. When the river fills with families in rented canoes, and the gravel bars are crowded with coolers and portable speakers, I'd put in at a low-water access point on a Monday morning, 5 days of food in a dry bag, no fixed itinerary beyond a general mileage target for each day, and a takeout point I'd arranged with a shuttle service. No one waiting for me at a specific time. No check-in schedule. I'd done enough solo river trips to know what I was doing, and enough solo trips on this particular river to know the stretch I'd be floating. I'd run the Upper Buffalo twice before, both times with a partner, and had always wanted to do the longer middle section alone. The outfitter who'd handled my shuttle had been straightforward and professional, asked no unusual questions, gave me a standard float plan form to fill out, and said to call when I reached the takeout. The first 2 days were everything I'd needed them to be. The weather was clear and cool, the river running at a comfortable level, the bluffs throwing afternoon shade across the water in long, dramatic diagonals. I saw 2 other canoes on the first day, and no one after that. By the second night, I'd settled into the rhythm that solo river camping produces when conditions are right: the early rising, the efficiency of the morning routine, the long, uninterrupted hours of paddling, in which the mind empties itself of everything that doesn't belong to the immediate physical world of water and current, and the reading of the river ahead. I slept both nights on gravel bars in the open without a tent, under a sky that this far from any city shows more stars than most people who haven't camped in genuinely dark places have ever seen. On the third day, I made good miles by early afternoon and found the gravel bar where I'd camped before the light started going. It was a wide bar on the inside of a long river bend, the gravel clean and flat, the river shallow and clear at its upstream edge and deepening into a long pool at the downstream end. On the landward side of the bar, a limestone outcrop rose maybe 6 feet from the gravel, a natural windbreak that I recognized immediately as the kind of feature that makes a campsite significantly more comfortable in variable weather. I pulled the canoe up above the waterline, unloaded my gear, and set up camp on the protected side of the outcrop with the limestone at my back and the river in front. I built my fire in the standard way small ring of river stones, tinder and kindling from the dry debris at the base of the outcrop, hardwood from a driftwood pile at the bar's upstream end that the river had deposited during a previous high water event. I cooked dinner, cleaned up, hung my food bag from a branch of the sycamore at the bar's edge, and sat by the dying fire watching the river go dark as the last light left the sky. The river in September at night sounds different from the river in daylight. The water seems louder when there's nothing visual to anchor it, the riffles upstream carrying their constant white noise downstream, and the pool below the bar holding a deeper, more periodic sound as the current worked against the limestone at the pool's far edge. I was watching the coals when I walked around the end of the outcrop to retrieve the water filter I'd left on the other side, and saw the second fire ring. It was 15 feet from the end of the outcrop, on the downstream side, in the open portion of the gravel bar I hadn't used. The construction was the same as mine, a rough circle of river stones, the stones similarly sized, the ring a similar diameter. Inside it, ash, gray and cold. The surface of it rained on or river misted into a flat crust. The edges of the ring stones darkened with old soot in the way stones darken after extended use. I crouched beside it and held my hand over the center of the ash. Cold. Not just cooled, but fully ambient, the temperature of the gravel around it, which meant the fire had been out for at least several hours and probably longer. 2 or 3 days, I estimated, based on the crust on the ash surface and the degree of weathering on the stone ring, which showed the kind of gray patina that river stones acquire after cycles of wetting and drying. The fire ring alone I could have explained easily enough. This was a popular bar, probably used regularly. Another paddler had camped here before me and left no other trace. It would have been unremarkable except for what was beside it. Under the overhang of the limestone on the downstream side of the outcrop where the rock created a shallow shelter above the gravel, the cache was arranged with intention. That was the first thing I registered, not its existence, but the intention evident in its arrangement. Dried meat, a significant quantity of it, wrapped in large green leaves that were fresh enough to still be pliable, the bundle tied closed with a strip of bark that had been split lengthwise to produce a flat binding material and knotted in a way I didn't recognize. Beside the meat bundle, a plastic water jug, the kind sold at dollar stores and gas stations, filled to the top and capped. Not an old jug, the plastic was still clear without the cloudiness that develops with extended UV exposure. Beside the jug, a bundle of firewood, pieces of split hardwood stacked in a tight column with a few fire starter materials. Dry bark, a folded piece of birch tucked into the top of the bundle. I crouched in front of it for a long time. The leaves wrapping the meat were fresh cut or picked within the last day, 2 at the outside, because leaves that age in September are still green and flexible rather than yellowing or brittle. The water jug was full, which meant someone had filled it recently and placed it here. The wood bundle was stacked with the care of someone storing wood they expect to use. Whoever had left this cache expected to come back to it. That was not a conclusion I reasoned toward. It was simply what the evidence stated, plainly and without ambiguity. The fresh leaves, the full water jug, the organized wood, these were not the remnants of a camp that had been broken and left. They were provisions. They were the preparations of someone who had been here, had left temporarily, and had arranged these things for their return. I stood up and looked at the river and looked at the bar, and looked at the tree line at the bar's landward edge, and thought about the fact that I was alone on a gravel bar in a remote section of the Buffalo River at 9 o'clock. At night, with someone else's provisions arranged under a limestone overhang 15 feet from my fire, and that the person who had arranged those provisions had not been gone long enough for the leaves to begin yellowing. I made the decision without deliberating over it for long. I went back to my side of the outcrop and broke camp. I did it efficiently and without lights beyond my headlamp, keeping the beam low, rolling my sleeping pad and stuffing my bag and loading the dry bags and carrying everything to the canoe in 2 trips. I was on the water in under 20 minutes. There was enough moonlight to paddle by on the open water and enough familiarity with river reading to navigate the riffles safely, and I paddled downstream for what I estimated was 4 miles before I found another gravel bar, smaller, less sheltered, on the opposite bank from the one I'd left, and pulled out and made a rough camp in the dark without a fire, lying in my sleeping bag on the open gravel and looking at the sky until I fell asleep sometime after midnight. In the morning, I told myself the obvious version of the story. Another paddler, camped at that bar for multiple nights, had gone for a day hike or an upstream exploration and left their provisions stored under the overhang. The fresh leaves were from today or yesterday because they'd replenished the cache recently. The water jug was full because they kept it full. The organization of it was simply the habit of a tidy camper. I had broken camp and paddled 4 miles in the dark over nothing more than another person's tidy campsite, and I should feel mildly foolish about it. That version of the story held reasonably well for the remaining 2 days of the float. I paddled out on Friday afternoon, reached the takeout, called the shuttle, loaded the canoe onto the truck, and drove back to the put-in to retrieve my car. The shuttle driver was a laconic man in his 60s who asked how the float had been, and I said it had been good, and I asked him about traffic on that stretch at this time of year, and he said it had been quiet, mostly done for the season by late September. I asked if he knew of many people camping in the primitive sections midweek, and he said not many, mostly day trippers this late in the year. I didn't mention the fire ring or the cache. I mentioned it to my friend Marcus about a week later, because Marcus had floated the Buffalo twice, and I wanted to tell the story to someone who knew the river. I told it the same way I've told it here in order, with detail, without embellishment. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone deciding whether to say the thing they're thinking. Then he said that section of the river had a reputation. I asked what kind of reputation. He said he'd heard things over the years from people who'd floated it. Nothing he could point to as a single, coherent account. More an accumulation of small things people had noticed and mentioned afterward, fire rings that didn't belong to any registered camper, signs of habitation in the primitive sections that didn't correspond to any permitted party, things found or heard or seen that everyone attributed to other paddlers, until they compared notes and found the timeline didn't add up. He said the local outfitter, not the one I'd used, a different operation on the western access, had a policy of not booking solo paddlers into the lower primitive sections after the 1st of September. He said he didn't know the reason for the policy specifically, that he'd heard it mentioned by someone who'd rented from them, and asked about going in late season alone, and been told they didn't do that booking. I asked if he knew why September specifically. He said he didn't. He said he'd always assumed it was a liability thing, a drowning risk concern related to lower water levels and strainers, the kind of thing outfitters worried about with solo paddlers in technical sections. But he said the way the person had described it, the outfitter had been specific about the solo part, not the season or the water level. Had said they'd put 2 paddlers in no problem, wouldn't put one in alone below a certain access point after September. We sat with that for a moment. Then he said he didn't want to make too much of it, that he'd floated that section twice without anything unusual, and that rivers attract their share of eccentric people living off the grid, who camp in primitive sections and don't register with outfitters and leave fire rings and cached food and move on. He said the Buffalo had always had that quality remote enough, in its middle sections, to support people who want to be genuinely invisible, who know the river well enough to use it as a corridor, and the primitive bars as rest points. He said that was probably all it was. He said it in the tone of someone who wants the thing they're saying to be true and isn't entirely certain it is. I've thought about the cache more carefully since that conversation, in the way you think about something when a new piece of information changes the frame around it. What I keep returning to is the leaves. The leaves wrapping the meat were fresh enough to still be fully pliable green, unspotted, the cells still holding moisture. In September in Arkansas, a freshly cut leaf begins to show stress within 24 to 36 hours of separation from the tree. The leaves on that bundle showed no stress, which means they had been placed within the last day, probably the last several hours. The plastic water jug was full, not partially full, filled to the cap, the water clear. Someone had sourced water and filled it and placed it there. The Buffalo River in that section runs clean enough to drink with filtration, but carrying and filling a jug requires intention and effort and a specific purpose. You fill a jug for storage, for return, for a period when you expect to be somewhere without direct water access, or when you want water available without the effort of filtering. The wood bundle was stacked with the kind of precision that comes from a person who has stacked wood many times and does it the same way every time. The fire starter materials tucked into the top were selected with knowledge, dry, inner bark, birch. The materials that catch easily and sustain a flame long enough to establish the larger wood. Someone who knows fires had assembled those materials and placed them there for the specific purpose of making the next fire easy to start. The fire ring itself, the old one, the one with the crusted ash, showed the darkening of extended use. Not one fire, many fires. The stones stained deeply at the interior face, the kind of staining that accumulates over a season or more of repeated use. This was not a bar that had been used once by a passing paddler. It was a place that had been used many times, over a long enough period to leave its record in the stones. I've tried to construct the version of this where it is simply an eccentric person, someone who lives rough along the river or uses it as a travel route and caches food and water at known rest points. The Buffalo does attract people like that. I've read accounts of long-distance paddlers and off-grid individuals who know the river well enough to use it as a home range, who camp in the primitive sections and leave no trace beyond fire rings, and the evidence I would expect a skilled outdoors person to leave. That version of the story is available to me. I use it when I need to. What it doesn't account for is the fresh leaves. A person who caches food along a river route doesn't typically rewrap the cache in fresh leaves every day or two. They wrap it once and leave it until they return. Fresh leaves means someone had been at that bar within hours of my arrival, had been there, had tended the cache, had left before I pulled my canoe onto the gravel, had possibly watched me set up camp from the tree line at the bar's landward edge, in the dark of a September evening, for whatever period of time passed between their departure and my discovery of the fire ring, or had not left before I arrived at all, had been on the other side of the limestone outcrop, in the downstream portion of the bar I hadn't walked before I set up camp, while I was building my fire and cooking my dinner, had waited with whatever patience they had developed through however long they'd been living in this way, in this place, along this river, until they were sure of what I was doing and what I intended, and whether I represented something they needed to respond to. I paddled 4 miles in the dark, and I didn't hear anything behind me on the water. That could mean no one was there. It could also mean that someone who knows a river very well moves along it in the dark without producing the sounds of a person who doesn't know it. I've been back to the Buffalo twice since that September, both times with a partner, both times in the spring. I've used different access points and floated different sections. I haven't been back to the primitive middle stretch where I found the cache. I tell myself that's about logistics, about the shuttle cost, about preferring sections I know well. Those reasons are all true as far as they go. The outfitter I used for my solo trip is still operating. I checked their website last spring when I was planning the return trip with my partner. They book solo paddlers into any section, any time of year. I thought about calling the other outfitter, the one Marcus mentioned, the one with the policy about solo paddlers below a certain access point after September, and asking them directly what the policy was based on. I composed that conversation in my head several times. I haven't made the call. I've considered what I would do with the answer if I got one, and I'm not sure I would do anything useful with it, and I'm not sure I want to know with any more clarity than I currently have. What I currently have is a fire ring with old ash and a cache of fresh provisions and a water jug filled recently by someone who expected to return to that bar, and the knowledge that I left before I found out whether they did. That is an uncomfortable thing to know and not know simultaneously. The version of the story where it is simply an unconventional outdoors person, someone who knows that river and that bar and uses it as a waypoint, is probably the correct version. It is the version that makes sense, that fits within the range of things that are true about how certain people live in relation to remote river corridors. I believe it most of the time. What I can't fully set aside is the freshness of the leaves, and the patience that would be required of someone who maintains that cache, who tends it and replenishes it and returns to that bar regularly enough to have worn the face of the fire ring stones dark with repeated fires over a long period, who does all of that along a stretch of river that at least one outfitter will not put a solo paddler into after the season turns, and the other boats go away and the gravel bars empty out, and the river runs quiet through the limestone bluffs with no one on it except the people who have decided, for whatever reason and in whatever way, that this is where they belong. I still think about that bar sometimes when I'm on moving water. The way it looked in the last of the firelight before I broke camp, the limestone outcrop throwing a shadow over the downstream portion of the gravel where the second ring sat with its cold ash. The cache under the overhang, the leaves still green, the wood stacked with the precision of long practice, the river moving past it all in the dark, carrying whatever sounds there were downstream and away. I paddled out of there as quietly as I could manage, and I didn't look back, and I'm glad I didn't. Some things are better understood at the distance you choose to maintain from them. That stretch of the Buffalo is beautiful in September. The bluffs are something I think about when I want to think about something that is purely good. I've tried to keep those two things separate in my mind, the beauty of the river and what was waiting on that bar, and mostly I've succeeded. Mostly. I've been coordinating volunteer trail maintenance on my section of the Sheltoi trace for 11 years. The section I'm responsible for runs for about 14 miles through a part of the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky that doesn't get a lot of foot traffic, not the dramatic gorge country that draws people to the Red River area, but quieter mixed hardwood terrain, ridge walking and hollow crossing, the kind of trail that attracts serious thru-hikers and locals who know it, and not many others. I took over the section from a man named Harold Combs, who'd maintained it for 16 years before his knees gave out, and he handed it to me with a binder of notes and a strong recommendation that I walk the full length twice before winter to get my baseline. I did, and then I've walked it, or sections of it, roughly twice a week since, which over 11 years adds up to a familiarity with that 14 miles that is difficult to overstate. I know every drainage crossing and every eroded switchback and every tree that's leaning toward the tread and every section of bank that's likely to slump after a hard rain. I know the trail the way you know a house you've lived in for a decade, not by thinking about it, but by feel, by the automatic recognition of what belongs and what doesn't. What that means, practically, is that I notice changes. Not all of them immediately, not all of them correctly identified on first observation, but I notice them. A blowdown across the tread that wasn't there 2 days ago. A section of water bar that's shifted. A tree that's dropped a major limb in the night. These things register as deviations from a known pattern, and the registration happens before I've consciously decided to look for anything. It's the same mechanism that makes you notice when a piece of furniture in your living room has been moved 6 inches. You know the room. The deviation finds you. The first thing I noticed was the branches. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, about 6 weeks before the incident that prompted me to contact the Forest Service. I was working a section of trail about 4 miles in from the northern trailhead, a stretch that runs along the top of a ridge before dropping into a hollow and crossing a seasonal creek. The trail on the ridgetop is exposed enough to catch windfall, and I'd expected to clear a few branches from the previous week's storms. What I found instead was branches that hadn't fallen, branches that had been cut or broken from standing trees and placed across the tread at intervals of roughly 20 to 25 feet. 5 of them, spanning the full width of the trail, laid perpendicular to the direction of travel. The wood was fresh, the break surfaces white and undarkened, the cut ends showing no oxidation, no browning of the exposed tissue. They hadn't been there 2 days earlier when I'd last walked this stretch. They'd been placed since then, and placed recently enough that the wood was still bright. I moved them off the trail and kept going. I told myself it was hikers, people who move branches for reasons I've never fully understood, who rearrange the natural material of the forest as a form of expression, or play, or territorial marking that has no particular meaning. I've seen it before, cairns built in places where cairns have no navigational function, sticks arranged in geometric patterns in clearings. The woods attract a certain amount of human behavior that doesn't resolve into a clear purpose. I moved the branches and went on. The following Thursday, I was on the same stretch, and there were more. Not the same branches, those were where I'd moved them, off the tread to the side. New branches, same placement, same interval, same perpendicular orientation to the trail direction. 8 of them this time, spanning the same general section of ridgetop trail. The wood was fresh again. I stood looking at them for a while before I moved them, trying to understand the spacing, which was too regular for windfall and too consistent for casual arrangement. 20 to 25 feet, over and over, with a precision that suggested measurement or a very well-calibrated eye. I moved them again and kept going, and this time I paid more attention to the edges of the trail as I walked. The Sheltoi through this section runs with laurel on both sides for long stretches, the rhododendron growing close to the tread in the hollows and pulling back somewhat on the ridgetops where the canopy is more open. I hadn't been looking at the laurel closely. I started looking at it. The cleared areas were harder to see than the branches. You had to know what you were looking for, had to be close enough and attentive enough to read the difference between undergrowth that had been disturbed and undergrowth that hadn't. But once I saw the first one, I couldn't stop seeing them. Roughly body-sized patches longer than wide. The dimensions of a person lying down where the laurel stems had been pressed back and the ground beneath cleared of debris and smoothed. Not violently cleared, not broken, but bent back with a deliberateness that preserved the stems so they'd hold the new position, that created an enclosed space within the laurel without destroying it. The ground in each cleared patch was packed in the way ground gets packed when weight is applied repeatedly, the same quality of compression I'd later recognize from what I found under the camping platform, though I didn't know that at the time. Each patch was roughly 10 to 15 feet off the trail. Each one was positioned with a clear sightline to the tread in both directions. I found 6 of them on that Thursday walk. I went back the following Tuesday and found 2 more, and I also found the first of the food remains. Food remains is the clinical term I settled on when I started keeping notes, which I did after that Tuesday because I'd crossed some internal threshold of concern that made documentation feel necessary. What I found on that Tuesday, and on the 2 subsequent visits before I contacted the Forest Service, was the evidence of meals consumed in shallow scrapes in the soil just off the trail, in positions that matched the pattern of the cleared laurel patches in terms of their sightlines to the tread. The scrapes were small, 6 to 8 inches across, a couple inches deep, and in each one were the bones of small animals, squirrel-sized and smaller, mostly, though one scrape held what I eventually decided were the remains of a rabbit. The bones had been fire-blackened and cracked, the cracking consistent with marrow extraction, the method deliberate and practiced. There was always a small ash deposit, not a fire ring, nothing built, just a shallow burning that left a compact gray residue at the center of the scrape, enough fire to cook with, no more than was needed. The freshness was the detail that I couldn't rationalize away. Every set of remains I found was fresh enough to smell, not decomposition smell, the smell of recently cooked meat, still present in the bones, overlaid with the char of the fire, the smell you'd encounter within hours of a meal rather than days after. On 2 of my 3 pre-report visits, the remains were fresh enough that the ash at the center of the scrape was still faintly warm when I held my hand over it. I was on the trail by 7 in the morning. Whatever had made those fires and eaten those meals had done so recently enough that the evidence hadn't cooled. I kept my notes for 3 visits, and then I sent an email to the Forest Service District Office describing what I'd found. I included the locations as best I could describe them: approximate mileage from the northern trailhead, compass bearings from the tread to the cleared patches, descriptions of the scrapes and their contents. I used careful, neutral language and described only what I'd observed rather than what I'd concluded, because I've dealt with the Forest Service for 11 years, and I know that they respond better to evidence than to interpretation. I said I'd found signs of possible human habitation along the trail corridor. I said I thought someone might be camping in the area on an extended basis. I said I thought it warranted a look. A ranger named Blevins called me the following morning. He was professional and thorough on the phone, asked several specific questions about the cleared areas and the scrape locations, and arranged to meet me at the northern trailhead 3 days later to walk the section together. In the meantime, he said, I should continue my maintenance visits as normal but not disturb the cleared areas or the scrapes any further. I said I understood. I met him at the trailhead at 6:30 on a Friday morning. He was younger than I'd expected from his voice on the phone, early 30s, fit, carrying a pack that had the look of regular field use. He had a clipboard and a camera, and he asked good questions from the start, the kind that told me he'd thought about what I'd described before he arrived. We walked north to south through the section I'd been monitoring, and I showed him the branch placements first. There were new ones I'd been checking, and there were always new ones by the time I came back, and he photographed them and measured the spacing with a tape measure he pulled from his pack. He didn't say anything about the spacing, but he wrote the measurements down twice. The cleared laurel areas I showed him second. He spent more time at these than at the branch placements. He crouched at the edge of each one and looked at the ground and the bent stems and the sight lines to the trail, and at the third one he said, the word I've been turning over ever since. He said it under his breath, not to me, not as a statement he was making to anyone in particular, just a word that came out when he was looking at the cleared space and its position relative to the trail. He said encampment, and then he stood up and moved on to the next one without elaborating, and I didn't ask him to, because his tone, when he said it wasn't the tone of someone identifying a problem they haven't seen before. It was the tone of someone naming something they recognize. The food scrapes affected him differently than the cleared areas had. At the cleared areas, he'd been methodical, professional, the body language of a person doing a job. At the first scrape, which was fresh enough that morning to still carry the meat smell clearly, he stopped and looked at it for a long time without crouching, without taking out the camera, without writing anything on his clipboard. Then he took a photograph and wrote something down and moved on, and he didn't say anything for the next quarter mile of trail. When he did speak, it was to ask me a procedural question about how often I walked this section and what time I typically started. I told him twice a week, usually 6:30 or 7 in the morning. He nodded and wrote that down too. We finished the walkthrough at the southern end of the monitoring section and stood at the trailhead there while he completed his notes. I asked him what he thought. He said he was going to file a report and have the district take a look at it. I asked what kind of look. He said he'd recommend a temporary closure of this section while they assessed the situation. I asked what he thought was going on. He said he wasn't in a position to speculate at this point. I asked if the word encampment had been speculation. He looked at me for a moment, a direct, evaluating look, the look of someone deciding whether to say more. And then he said that sometimes people established long-term presences in remote sections of forest that the Forest Service had to address. He said it in a way that was technically informative and practically empty, and I understood that he was done talking about it with me. The section closure was posted 4 days later. 11 days, the notice said, for trail assessment and resource management. I drove by the northern trailhead and saw the closure sign and sat in my truck and looked at it for a while. 11 days is not a casual closure. I've been coordinating this section for 11 years, and I'd never seen it closed for more than 3, and that was for a bridge washout. 11 days for trail assessment and resource management meant something was being done that took time, required personnel, and that the Forest Service had decided to describe in the vaguest available terms. I called Ranger Blevins twice during the closure. The first call went to voicemail and wasn't returned. The second call reached him, and he told me the assessment was ongoing and that he'd be in touch when the section was cleared for reopening. I asked if he could tell me anything about what they'd found. He said the assessment was still active and he couldn't discuss specifics at this time. I asked if I should modify my maintenance approach when the section reopened. He said standard protocol would be fine. That was the last conversation I had with him. The section reopened on day 12, one day after the posted date. I was there the morning it reopened. I walked the full monitoring stretch before I did anything else, from north to south, looking at everything I'd been looking at for the 6 weeks prior. The branch placements were gone, not moved to the sides of the trail the way I'd been moving them, but gone, no sign of them. The cleared areas in the laurel had been raked over, the compressed ground broken up, the bent stems released or trimmed where they'd held their new positions, the spaces restored to something that would read as undisturbed to anyone who hadn't seen them before. The scrapes were gone, filled in and smoothed, the soil over them raked to match the surrounding surface. I walked the whole 14 miles of my section that day, not just the monitoring stretch, and found nothing that I hadn't put there myself. Whatever they'd found, whatever Blevins had seen, when he'd set encampment under his breath at the edge of a cleared laurel patch with a sightline in both directions, had been removed, or had removed itself, or both, and the Forest Service had erased the physical evidence with a thoroughness that told me the effort had been intentional, and that the intentionality was itself a kind of information. Nobody told me what they'd found. I sent an email to the district office asking for any documentation related to the closure that was available under public records requests. I received a response 2 weeks later informing me that the closure records were available for review and providing a case number. When I went to review them, the documentation consisted of 3 pages. The closure notice, a 1-paragraph assessment summary that described the closure as precautionary and the situation as resolved, and a reopening notice. The assessment summary contained no findings. It said the area had been evaluated and that no ongoing concerns had been identified. It did not say what had been evaluated. It did not say what had been there. I still walk that section twice a week. I've been walking it for 5 months since the reopening, and I haven't found anything. No branch placements, no cleared areas, no scrapes. The trail is what it was before I started noticing the changes. A 14-mile stretch of mixed hardwood terrain that gets moderate traffic and no particular attention from the outside world. My maintenance notes for the past 5 months are unremarkable. I have nothing to report. But I think about what Blevins saw at that cleared laurel area, the one where he stopped moving and said the word under his breath before he caught himself. I think about what made a man who walked remote sections of national forest for a living stop and look without crouching, without photographing, without writing anything down, before he recovered himself and went back to doing his job. I think about the sight lines, the way each cleared area was positioned to give whoever occupied it a clear view of the trail in both directions, the way that positioning implied not just presence but awareness, the conscious arrangement of a space for observation. I think about the branch placements and their consistent spacing, the 20 to 25 feet maintained with a precision that suggested long practice, a person who had been placing markers for long enough that the spacing had become automatic. I think about what it means to monitor a trail section, what it means to know a piece of ground well enough to notice what doesn't belong, to track changes across visits, to establish a baseline of the normal against which deviations register. I think about that because I understand it from the maintenance side. That's what I do. That's the skill I've spent 11 years building, the capacity to read a section of trail and know when something is different. And I've thought many times in the months since the reopening about the fact that what I was noticing on those 6 weeks of visits was not random activity. It was a system. Branches at consistent intervals. Cleared areas at consistent distances from the tread with consistent sight lines. Feeding sites at consistent positions relative to the cleared areas. Someone had been monitoring my section of the Sheltoi trace. Someone had established a systematic presence along 14 miles of trail in a way that was designed for observation rather than passage, that was arranged to see without being seen, that had been in place long enough and maintained with enough regularity that it had become part of the physical character of the corridor. The thing I come back to, the thing that lives at the back of my maintenance walks now in a way it didn't before, is the freshness of those scrapes. the warmth of the ash at 7 in the morning. Whatever was eating along that trail was eating there in the early morning hours, which means it was present along the tread at the same time I was. Had been present at the same time I was, on the same trail. For the 6 weeks I was documenting the changes, and probably for a period before that when I was still moving the branches without registering the full pattern. I've been walking my section twice a week for 11 years. The cleared areas, once I knew to look for them, had the quality of establishment, the compressed ground, the trained stems, the arrangement. They hadn't appeared in the 6 weeks I was monitoring them. They'd been there, or something like them had been there, for longer than that, long enough to become settled, long enough to be, in some sense that I don't have a word for, known. I don't tell the other volunteers what I found. The section I coordinate has 3 other regular maintainers who cover portions of the 14 miles, and none of them mention noticing anything unusual in the months before the closure, and I've chosen not to share my documentation with them. I'm not sure what it would accomplish. The section is clean now. The closure resolved whatever needed resolving, or moved whatever needed moving, or otherwise changed the situation in a way that has left no physical trace for me to point to. If I told them what I'd found, and what I'd concluded about it, I'd be telling them something they couldn't do anything with except carry it the next time they were on the trail at 7 in the morning with the laurel close on both sides. That's the thing about knowing a piece of ground well. You know when it's different. You know when something has changed even before you've identified the specific change. There's a quality of attention in a space that's been inhabited, a density, something that the body registers before the mind assembles the evidence. I felt it on the trail in those 6 weeks, and I thought I was projecting, thought I was importing the dread from my notes into my experience of the walking. Now I think the body was doing what bodies do, which is receive information that the conscious mind is still working to organize. Something was there. Something that had been there for a while, and that knew the trail better than most of the people who walked it, and that had arranged its presence along the corridor with a patience and a consistency that still strikes me, months later, as the most unsettling element of all of it. Not the bones, not the warmth of the ash, the patience. The long, systematic, undetected patience of something that had been watching my section of trail from cleared spaces with sight lines in both directions for what I suspect was a very long time before I started looking back. I still go out twice a week. I clear the blowdowns and reset the water bars and check the drainage structures and walk all 14 miles with the same attention I've always brought to it. The trail is what it was. My notes are unremarkable, but I go earlier now. I'm on the tread by 6, sometimes 5:30 in the dim, because I've decided that whatever comfort I have in this work comes from being first on the trail in the morning rather than second. I haven't examined that decision too carefully. I've just made it, and I keep making it every time I load the truck in the dark and drive to the trailhead and pull on my pack and step onto the Sheltoi before the light is fully up. I don't know if it matters. I don't know if earlier is safer or just earlier. I don't know if the cleared areas are gone or only resting. I don't know what Blevins saw that made him say that word before he caught himself. I know the trail. I know when it's different. I keep going anyway because the trail needs maintaining, and I'm the one who knows it. And because 11 years of walking something teaches you that the knowing itself is worth something, even when what you know is that you've been watched from the laurel, and the watching was patient enough and careful enough that it looked, for a long time, exactly like nothing at all. My hiking partner, Reese, had been planning this trip for the better part of a year. That's not unusual for him. He approaches backcountry travel the way some people approach legal briefs or engineering problems, with a thoroughness that begins months in advance and produces, by the time of departure, a folder of printed permits, trail profiles, water source locations, elevation gain summaries, and contingency routes that he updates whenever new information becomes available. I've been hiking with Reese for 14 years, and I've learned to trust his planning completely, which means I contribute gear and judgment and physical capability and leave the logistics to him. It's an arrangement that has served us well across a lot of miles and a lot of different ranges, and there was nothing about our Great Smoky Mountains trip in October that gave me any reason to question it. We were doing a 4-day loop in the backcountry, starting and ending at the same trailhead in the Tennessee side of the park, covering roughly 38 miles through a section of the Smokies that Reese had identified as less trafficked than the popular routes near Klingman's Dome or the Alum Cave Corridor. The permit system in the Smokies assigns you to specific backcountry campsites. Each night you can't freelance your camping location, which is part of how the park manages impact and, theoretically, ensures that someone always knows where you are. Reese had the permit for all 4 sites printed and laminated and carried in the top pocket of his pack. He'd researched each site, knew the water sources, knew the bear box locations, knew which sites had had recent animal activity reported in the Park Service's public-facing maintenance logs. Backcountry Site 34 was our second night stop. It sat in a hollow about 8 miles from the trailhead we'd entered from, accessible by a trail that dropped off a ridge into a cove of old-growth hemlock before crossing a creek and climbing slightly to a flat area where the Park Service had installed 2 bear boxes and a tent pad. Reese knew from his research that it was a small site capacity for 6 people, seldom fully booked, and that it had good water from the creek and was far enough from popular routes that we were unlikely to share it. He'd chosen it specifically for those qualities. We arrived in the early afternoon of the second day, having covered about 12 miles from our first night camp. The trail into the hollow was beautiful in the specific way of old-growth hemlock country, the canopy close and dark overhead, the understory stripped by the shade to bare ground carpeted in accumulated needles, the light flat and green and diffuse in a way that makes everything look slightly underwater. The creek crossing was straightforward, ankle-deep on stepping stones, and the climb to the flat was short. We came into the campsite clearing at about 2 in the afternoon with enough daylight left to set up comfortably and still have time to filter water and eat before dark. Reese saw the bear box first. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, and I came up beside him and looked at what he was looking at. And it took me a moment to understand what was wrong with it, because what was wrong with it wasn't something I'd encountered before. The box was standing open. That by itself isn't unusual. People sometimes don't latch them correctly and wind or animal pressure pops them, but the locking bar was bent. Not bent by external force, not the deformation of something trying to break in from the outside, but bent outward, away from the box, in the specific geometry of force applied from inside. The locking bar on a Smoky Mountains backcountry bear box is a steel rod that slides through 2 brackets on the lid and drops into a notch on the box body. And for it to be bent the way this one was bent, the force would have had to come from within the locked box, pushing up against the bar, bending it past the yield point of the metal, until the engagement in the notch failed and the lid came free. I stood there, looking at it and running the mechanics through my head and not arriving at anything comfortable. Reese had his phone out and was photographing the locking bar from several angles without saying anything. I walked to the box and looked inside. The interior was scraped clean, not empty the way a box is empty when no one's left anything in it, but scraped the surfaces, showing the marks of something moving across them with force. Whatever had been left by previous parties cleared out entirely. The smell inside was organic and recent, a warm animal smell that hadn't dissipated. I turned around and looked at the ground around the box, and that was when I saw the objects. There were 4 of them, arranged on the ground within a radius of about 3 feet from the base of the box. Arranged is the right word. They were not scattered, not dropped, not distributed randomly the way things fall when someone empties a pack or loses their grip on something. They were placed, set down with the deliberateness of someone putting objects in specific positions, and the positioning had a quality of intention that I registered before I understood any individual object well enough to describe it. The first was a section of tarpaulin material, roughly 18 by 24 inches, cut cleanly along all 4 edges with something sharp. Along each edge of the tarp, pressed through the material at intervals of about 4 inches, were grommets, not the stamped metal grommets that come factory installed in manufactured tarps, but grommets that had been made by hand, using a method I looked at for a long time and couldn't fully reconstruct. The holes had been cut or punched and then reinforced with a ring of material leather or something processed to a leather-like consistency, pressed through and folded and fixed in place with a binding I couldn't identify, something twisted and organic that had been threaded through and knotted on both sides. The workmanship was consistent throughout. Whoever had made the grommets had done it the same way on every one, which meant they had a method, and the method had been applied with the patience of someone for whom this kind of work was normal. The second object was 3 wooden skewers, bundled together and tied with plant fiber cordage. The skewers were hand-cut from straight-grained wood, whittled to points that were smooth and even, not the rough points of a hurried job, but the careful taper of someone who'd done this many times. The cordage holding them together was the same twisted plant fiber I'd later come to recognize as a consistent signature across everything at that site. Tight, practiced, the twist uniform along the length, the technique identical to what I'd see in maritime rope making or any traditional cordage tradition where the skill is passed along and refined over time. The third object was a glass jar, the kind that might have once held commercial preserves, sealed across the top with pine pitch, real pine pitch, resinous and dark, applied in a thick bead around the lid's circumference, and smoothed while it was warm. Through the glass, the contents were visible, a pale, dense substance, semi-solid, with the visual quality of rendered fat that is cooled and set. The jar was clean on the outside, the glass clear, the pitch seal neat. The fourth object was a length of cordage, longer than the bundle ties, coiled and placed. About 4 feet long when I later stretched it out, the same plant fiber twist, with a loop worked into one end, using a method that took me several minutes to understand, and that I eventually identified as something close to a bowline. A fixed loop that wouldn't slip or tighten under load, the kind of knot that has been made by people doing serious rope work for a very long time. I stood in that clearing for a long time looking at those 4 objects and not speaking, and Reese photographed each one from multiple angles, and also did not speak. The light in the hollow was already going by 4 o'clock, the hemlock canopy accelerating the process that the ridge above us would have begun regardless, and we were going to need to make decisions about the night. We'd been assigned this site. We had a permit. The alternative was to hike out in failing light on a trail we didn't know well, covering 8 miles to the trailhead in conditions that would become genuinely dangerous after full dark. The rational decision, which Reese articulated once we'd both stepped back from the bear box and had our packs off and were standing at the opposite end of the clearing, was to stay, set up the tent, make no fire, eat cold food from the packs, and leave before first light. We made that decision, and we executed it without much further discussion. I set up the tent while Reese filtered water from the creek, and we ate sitting in the tent with the doors zipped and our headlamps on low. And we talked about the objects in the way you talk about something when you're trying to think through it, without landing on the conclusion that the thinking is building toward. We talked about the grommets, the technique, the consistency, the material. We talked about the jar and what you'd use rendered fat for, and what it meant that someone had sealed it carefully and left it beside a bear box they'd forced from the inside. We talked about whether the objects had been left as a kind of exchange, payment for the food that had been taken, and what it meant that whoever had left them understood the concept of exchange well enough to arrange objects around the site of the taking in a way that communicated intentionality. That last part was the part we talked around rather than directly, because talking around it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was that something had been inside the locked bear box, had broken out of it rather than into it, bending the locking bar outward from within, which meant it had gone in voluntarily and been locked in, had pulled the lid down from inside and dropped the locking bar into the notch, or had been put inside by someone else. Either of those possibilities implied a relationship to enclosed space and to the mechanics of the box that I did not want to think about in a tent, 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, in full dark, in a hollow in the Great Smoky Mountains. So we talked around it. We ate our food and drank our filtered water and kept the headlamps on until we decided, by unspoken mutual agreement, that the light was drawing more attention than the dark would. I slept badly. Reese, as far as I could tell, didn't sleep at all. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard movement outside the tent, not close, not threatening in the immediate physical sense, but present. Something moving through the clearing perimeter at a distance. I judged as roughly where the tree line was, moving slowly and without urgency, the sound of it passing from one side of the clearing to the other, and then going quiet. I lay still and timed my breathing, and did not unzip the tent. The sound didn't repeat. The night was otherwise what you'd expect: creek noise, wind in the canopy above the hollow, the settling sounds of old growth. I lay there until the quality of darkness through the tent fabric shifted and I could tell that the sky was changing. And then I said Reese's name quietly, and he said, "I'm awake," in a voice that confirmed he'd been awake for a long time. We were packed and moving before 6. We left the objects where they were, which felt like the right decision, though I couldn't have articulated why it felt wrong to disturb the arrangement. Wrong in the way it feels wrong to move things at a scene before you fully understand what the scene is. We crossed the creek in the gray pre-dawn and climbed out of the hollow and hit the ridge trail and moved fast. We covered 8 miles in under 3 hours and came out at the trailhead before 9. Reese filed the report that afternoon at the Park Service Visitor Center. The ranger who took the report was a woman in her 40s who listened carefully and asked specific questions. She asked about the grommets first, how many, what material, how they'd been fixed. She asked about the jar and its contents and the pitch seal. She asked about the cordage and whether the twist was consistent along the length, which was an oddly precise question that told me she'd been thinking about what she was hearing in terms of a framework she already had. She took notes throughout, not the cursory notes of someone going through a reporting protocol, but the detailed notes of someone who wanted to get it exactly right. When Reese finished, she looked at what she'd written for a moment, and then she told us it wasn't the first report from Site 34 this season. Reese asked how many there had been. She said she wasn't able to share that information. She said it in a way that was professionally neutral, and that I've thought about many times since, because there are 2 versions of not being able to share information. One is the bureaucratic version, the version that means the information is restricted by policy and the person giving it is following protocol. The other is the version that means the information exists and is known and is being managed in a specific way, and that the management is itself a considered decision rather than a default. Her version felt like the second kind. The specific questions she'd asked about the grommets, the pitch, the cordage twist were not the questions of someone encountering a new category of report. They were the questions of someone building a more detailed picture of something she'd been building a picture of for a while. I've done what research I can since we got home. The Park Service's public-facing maintenance and incident logs for the Smokies backcountry are available online, updated irregularly, and they contain records of site closures and animal activity and trail conditions going back several years. I searched Site 34 specifically. I found 2 temporary closures in the past 3 years, both listed as precautionary closures for assessment, both lasting between 10 and 14 days, both without documentation of findings in the publicly available record. The most recent was 8 months before our visit. The site had been returned to the permit system following each closure without any notation about what the assessment had found or whether the situation had been resolved. What I keep returning to is the inside of the locking bar, the direction of the force. I've handled a lot of backcountry bear boxes across a lot of parks and forests, and the wear and damage on them is almost always consistent with external pressure, the marks of animals trying to get in. The bent bar at Site 34 was bent outward. Whatever produced that deformation was applying force from inside the box, pushing up against the bar with enough sustained pressure to bend steel past its yield point and disengage it from the notch. That is a specific kind of force applied in a specific direction for a specific purpose, and understanding it requires understanding that the thing inside the box was trying to get out, which requires accepting that the thing had gotten in voluntarily, or had been placed there, and that either of those circumstances was possible. I've thought about the exchange quality of the arrangement, the objects placed around the base of the box after the food had been taken, their positioning deliberate enough to read as intentional, the items themselves representing significant labor and skill. The tarp section, with its handmade grommets, the sharpened skewers, the rendered fat in its sealed jar, the knotted cordage. None of those objects are casual. Each one represents time and knowledge, the knowledge of how to make a grommet without manufactured materials, how to render fat and seal a container with pine pitch, how to twist plant fiber into cordage of consistent quality, and work a functional loop into the end of it. These are old skills, not lost skills. They exist in wilderness survival literature and in the practices of traditional cultures, but skills that require practice to do well, and all 4 objects showed a quality of execution that came from practice. Whoever had made them had made many things like them before. The rendered fat I think about most specifically. Rendered fat is a preserved food source and a raw material for a range of other uses: waterproofing, fire starting, skin protection in cold weather, adhesive when combined with other materials. Sealing it in a glass jar with pine pitch suggests an understanding of preservation that the fat would keep longer sealed than unsealed, that the seal was worth the additional effort. The jar itself was a found or salvaged object, not something manufactured for this purpose. Someone had looked at a glass jar and understood its utility for storage and had acquired pine pitch and applied it in a functional bead around the lid. That sequence of understanding and action implies a mind that evaluates materials for utility and applies knowledge to solve practical problems. It implies, in other words, something that thinks. I don't know what was in that bear box before we arrived. I don't know how long the objects had been arranged on the ground around it. They were dry and showed no weather damage, which suggested hours rather than days, but I can't be certain. I don't know what moved around the perimeter of the clearing in the middle of the night, or how long it had been there before it moved, or whether it had been watching the tent from the tree line in the hours before the movement I heard. I don't know how many reports the ranger at the visitor center had in her file for Site 34. I don't know what the 2 previous assessments had found, or why the site had been returned to the permit system without public documentation of findings, or whether the person who'd made that decision had been comfortable making it. What I know is the bend of the locking bar, which I can still see when I close my eyes, the steel deformed in the specific direction of outward pressure, the geometry of something pushing to get out. What I know is the consistency of the cordage on those 4 objects, the same twist, the same technique, applied to each one with a uniformity that meant practice. What I know is the specific questions the ranger asked, the ones that told me she'd been building this picture from other people's reports for longer than our single incident. Reese hasn't been back to the Smokies. He's planning a trip to the Cascades for next fall, a range he knows well and has good maps for. He's put together the permit applications and the gear list and the contingency routes with the same thoroughness he brings to everything. When he sent me the planning documents, he included a note at the bottom that said only, different drainage system, different elevation, different species profile. I understood what he meant. He meant he'd thought about what the species profile of the Smokies backcountry had contained and had decided to go somewhere that contained different things. He didn't specify what things. He didn't need to. I've been asked a few times, since we got back, whether I think what happened at Site 34 was dangerous, whether we were at risk. The honest answer is that I don't know, and that the not knowing is itself part of what I've been sitting with for the month since. Nothing happened to us. We slept badly and left early, and came home with photographs and a filed report, and a memory of objects arranged with deliberate care on the ground, beside a forced bear box in a hemlock hollow 8 miles from the nearest road. Whatever moved around the perimeter of the clearing in the night did not approach the tent. Whatever had been in that box was not in it when we arrived. The exchange, if it was an exchange, was complete before we got there. But I think about the ranger's specific questions. I think about what you'd have to have seen or heard from other reports to know, to ask about the cordage twist and the grommet material and the pitch seal. I think about what kind of picture you'd be building from those questions. What pattern of evidence across multiple incidents at the same backcountry site would teach you to look for those specific details. I think about what it means that she knew to look for them, and that the site had been assessed twice and returned to service, and that when I asked how many reports there had been, she looked at her notes for a moment before she said she wasn't able to share that. The jar is the thing I'd go back for. If I could go back for anything, I'd want to know what was in it, whether it was animal fat or something else, whether it was a food cache or a trade good or something intended for a specific use. I can't identify from the outside of a sealed glass jar. I'd want to understand the economy of it, the logic of taking food from a bear box and leaving rendered fat in a sealed jar as something like compensation. I'd want to understand what that exchange says about the understanding behind it, the understanding that the box contained things of value, that taking value without leaving something in return is a kind of transgression, that the appropriate response to taking is to give back. That understanding is not nothing. That understanding is a specific and human thing, and sitting with it in a tent, in a hollow in the Great Smoky Mountains at 2 in the morning, with something moving slowly along the tree line outside, is its own kind of experience, distinct from fear in the ordinary sense, more complicated and more lasting. We left before first light, and we didn't look back, and we haven't been back. The site is still in the permit system. Someone is probably sleeping there tonight, or will be soon, with a permit in their pack and a bear box latched outside, and the hemlock canopy overhead, and the creak noise coming up from the hollow below. I hope the box is intact. I hope they sleep well. I hope they don't hear anything moving along the perimeter in the dark. And if they do, I hope they stay in the tent and wait for morning the way we did. I hope that's enough. We never established, in the months since, whether staying in the tent had been the right decision or just the decision we'd made, and whether those two things were the same. There were 4 of us, and the trip had been my idea. I want to say that because it matters to how I've carried what happened, since the knowledge that I was the one who'd suggested the campground, who'd made the reservation, who'd talked the others into a long weekend in the Cherokee National Forest, when 2 of them had been inclined towards something closer to home and more convenient. I'd been to that campground once before, years earlier, and remembered it as the right kind of place for a group that wanted comfort without the full apparatus of resort camping numbered sites. Yes, and a vault toilet at the loop's end, and a camp host in a small trailer near the entrance, but also real quiet, real dark, and a creek running behind the back row of sites that I remembered as beautiful in the specific way of East Tennessee mountain streams, cold and clear over rounded limestone, with hemlocks leaning over it from both banks. The 4 of us were myself, my college roommate Darla, a woman named Petra who'd worked with Darla for years and who I'd met a handful of times and liked, and Petra's boyfriend at the time, a quiet man named Curtis, who was an avid fisherman and had agreed to come on the condition that he could spend Saturday morning working the creek. We drove up from Knoxville on a Thursday afternoon in late May, found the campground without difficulty on a forest road off a state highway in the mountains above the Hiwassee River drainage, and were checked in and set up by 6. The campground was perhaps a third full, a few families in the middle of the loop, a couple of solo campers, a pair of men in their 60s with a truck camper who'd clearly been there for several days. The back row of sites, closest to the creek, had only us and one other party, a couple who kept to themselves and left early the following morning. The site we'd reserved had direct creek access, a short path through a strip of hemlock and rhododendron that connected the back of the site to the bank, where someone had placed 2 large flat rocks at the water's edge that served as natural seats or platforms for filtering water or just sitting and looking at the current. I walked down to the creek the first evening after we'd eaten, just to sit for a few minutes in the last light, and the water was everything I'd remembered, shallow and clear, moving with the purpose and music of a stream that knows its channel well, the hemlocks on both banks making a canopy that held the remaining daylight in a green suspension above the surface. I sat on one of the flat rocks for maybe 20 minutes before the light was fully gone and then walked back to the fire. It rained that night. Not dramatically, no lightning, no wind, just a steady, moderate fall that started around midnight and lasted until perhaps 4 in the morning. I heard it on the tent fly and found it pleasant in the way that rain on a tent fly is pleasant when you're warm and horizontal and have nowhere to be. I went back to sleep and woke to the specific clarity of air that follows overnight rain, everything washed and slightly brightened, the smell of wet hemlock and wet soil, and the creek running higher and faster than it had the evening before. Darla found the shoes at 7:15. I know the time because I just looked at my watch when I heard her call from the direction of the creek path. Not a scream, not alarm in the acute sense, but the voice of someone who has seen something that requires other people to come and look at it. I was the first one to her because my tent was closest to the path, and I pushed through the rhododendron and came out on the bank and found her standing on one of the flat rocks, looking at the other flat rock. The shoes were sitting on the rock closest to the water's edge, arranged in 2 pairs side by side facing the creek. 4 shoes total, 2 pairs, clearly different sizes. 1 pair small enough to belong to a child of perhaps 2 or 3, and the other pair sized for a child of 6 or 7. They were leather shoes, lace-up, with a rounded toe and a low flat heel, the style of construction belonging to an era that ended before either Darla or I had been born. The leather was stiff and dark, the surface cracked and dry in the way of leather that has been subjected to extended stress without conditioning, the kind of dry that develops over decades rather than seasons. The soles were worn through completely at the balls of both feet on all 4 shoes. Not thinning, worn through, the leather gone entirely at the point of greatest contact, the edges of the holes smooth with long use. The laces on all 4 shoes were tied. Small bows, the kind a child makes when learning to tie shoes. The loops uneven but the knot secure. The shoes were facing the water, toes pointing toward the creek's edge, heels toward us, as if the children who'd worn them had stepped out of them at the rock's edge and waded in. Darla and I stood there looking at them for what felt like a long time before either of us spoke. The first thing she said was that they were dry. I looked and understood what she meant immediately around us. Every surface was wet. The flat rock we were standing on was wet. The rock the shoes were sitting on was wet, everywhere except where the shoes were sitting, and for a small radius around each shoe. The hemlock bark was wet, the rhododendron leaves were beaded with rain, the soil of the bank was saturated, the creek itself was running visibly higher than it had been the previous evening. The rain had been steady for 4 hours, and had left its mark on every surface in the landscape. The shoes were dry, not just unmisted dry, with the texture and feel of leather that has not been in contact with moisture recently. The soles of all 4 shoes were dry on the bottom. Curtis and Petra came down the path while we were still standing there, attracted by our continued absence and Darla's initial call. They came out on the bank and looked at the shoes, and nobody said anything for another minute. Then Curtis crouched down and looked at the shoes from the side without touching them and said the leather was old. He said it in the way of someone who works with materials and has developed an eye for age matter of fact, not interpretive, just naming what he was seeing. He said the wear on the soles was consistent with long regular use, not decorative wear, not artificial distressing. He said they'd been worn. We walked back to the site, and I went to find the camp host. He was a man in his late 50s named Alderman who managed the campground from a small trailer near the entrance loop, and I found him drinking coffee outside his trailer in the post-rain morning air. I told him what we'd found. He listened carefully and asked me to describe the shoes in detail, which I did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he'd never seen them before and had no idea where they'd come from. He said it with a quality of attention that told me he was taking it seriously, and then he said he'd call the ranger station and have someone come out to look. The ranger arrived about 40 minutes later. She was a young woman, efficient and thorough, and she went down to the creek with me and photographed the shoes from multiple angles before doing anything else. She asked whether any of us had touched them. None of us had. She asked whether anyone had been at the creek the previous evening, and I told her I'd been there before the rain and the shoes hadn't been there then. She wrote that down. She asked about the other campers whether anyone in the campground had children with them. I told her I hadn't seen any young children in the campground. She said she'd check with the host. She spent about 20 minutes at the creek taking photographs and looking at the bank in both directions before coming back up to our site. She said she was going to walk the creek in both directions for a quarter mile and asked us to stay at the site if we could. We said we would. She was gone for about 45 minutes, and when she came back, she said she hadn't found anything. She said it in a neutral, professional way that didn't invite follow-up, and then she asked again whether we'd touched the shoes, and we confirmed again that we hadn't. She said she'd file a report and look into it further. She drove out of the campground shortly after. 2 hours later, I walked back down to the creek. The shoes were still there. I stood on the rock and looked at them for a while without touching them. The morning was warming and the creek was still running high, and everything around the shoes had dried somewhat in the 2 hours since we'd first found them. But the surface of the rock beneath and around the shoes was still distinctly drier than the surrounding stone, as if the dryness had originated with the shoes rather than occurring independently. I crouched down close to look at the laces. They were tied with the specific, inexact symmetry of a child's bow, not an adult's bow, not a bow tied by someone mimicking a child's tie, but the genuine uneven loops of small hands, learning the motion, one loop larger than the other on each shoe, the knot pulled tight in the specific way. Children pull knots tight before they know that tight isn't the same as secure. I've tied a lot of children's shoes in my life. I have 2 nephews and a niece, and I've been the designated shoe tier at family events for a decade, and the bows on those 4 shoes looked exactly like the work of children who'd tied their own shoes, and were still learning. I went back to the site and didn't say what I'd observed about the laces to the others. I'm not sure why. It felt like information that would change the character of what we were sitting with in a way I wasn't ready for yet. We spent the day at the campground. The fishing Curtis had planned wasn't going to happen. None of us wanted to be at the creek more than we had to be. though we didn't discuss this explicitly. We sat at the site and made food and read and talked about other things, and the creak sounds came through the hemlock strip from behind us all day, and I was aware of them in a way I hadn't been the day before. At some point in the afternoon, Darla asked the host whether he knew anything about the history of the campground, whether it had been in use for a long time. He said the campground had been developed in the 60s, but that people had been using the creek bottom for recreation and seasonal camping going back much further. He said there were records of family camps in the area from the early part of the 20th century, before the National Forest designation had formalized access. He said it in a casual, informational way, just historical context, and I thanked him and went back to the site. Early part of the 20th century. The style of the shoes, Curtis had said, was consistent with that period. A rounded toe, a flat heel, leather construction, lace-up closure, the standard footwear for children in the decades before rubber-soled athletic shoes became common. I'd looked at photographs of early 20th century Appalachian families in a book I'd read the previous year, and the children in those photographs had worn shoes that looked like the shoes on the rock. I sat with that connection all afternoon and didn't share it. The following morning, the shoes were gone. I was the first one down to the creek, before anyone else was moving. At first light, the flat rock was empty. I stood on the rock where we'd stood the previous morning and looked at the other rock, and it was bare stone, slightly wet from the dew, nothing on its surface. I looked up and down the bank as far as I could see in both directions. Nothing. I walked the bank north for about 50 yards and south for about 50 yards and found nothing that hadn't been there before. The shoes had been present at 7:15 the previous morning. They were gone before 6 the following morning. Whether they'd been there at midnight or gone by 9 in the evening, or moved at some point in between, I had no way to know. I called the ranger station when we got home. I asked to speak with the ranger who'd responded to our report and was told she was unavailable but that someone would return my call. A different ranger called me back the following afternoon. When I gave him my name and the campground and the date of the incident and described the report that had been filed, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said there was no record of that report in the system. I asked him to check again with the date and campground name and the responding ranger's description. He said he'd check and put me on hold for several minutes. When he came back, he said he couldn't find a report matching my description in the system for that date or campground. He asked if I was certain of the date. I was certain. He asked if I might have misidentified the campground. I had not. He said he was sorry he couldn't be more helpful, and that if I wanted to file a new report, I could do so by phone or at any visitor contact station. I filed a new report. I described the shoes in detail, the size, the style, the condition, the dryness, the laced bows, and the circumstances of their discovery and disappearance. The person who took the report was professional and asked appropriate clarifying questions and gave me a case number. I've called that case number twice in the month since. Both times I've been told the case is noted in the system but that there are no findings to report at this time. What I keep returning to, when I let myself think about it fully, is the dryness. Not the style of the shoes, not the wear on the soles, not even the laced bows, the dryness. 4 hours of moderate rain, falling on every surface in the landscape, and 4 shoes sitting on a flat rock at the edge of a creek that was running visibly higher from the accumulation, and the shoes dry, not damp, not merely protected from the most direct rainfall by some overhang or canopy dry, with the specific dry texture of leather that has not been in contact with moisture recently, sitting on a surface that was wet everywhere except where they sat. I've tried every explanation I can think of for that, and I haven't found one that holds. Someone placed them there after the rain stopped at 4 in the morning, but the surrounding rock was wet when we found them at 7:15, which means the rain had only been gone for 3 hours, and any shoes placed after the rain would be sitting in a landscape still wet from it, would not themselves be dry from a pre-rain placement. Someone protected them during the rain with a covering that they removed before dawn, but no covering would leave that perfect circular dryness on the rock surface beneath each shoe and in the small radius around each shoe, because the covering would have to have been fitted exactly to the shoe's footprint, which is not how coverings work. Someone constructed an elaborate deception for reasons I cannot identify, but the construction of that deception would have required knowledge of the rain's timing and duration and access to the creek behind an occupied campsite. In the dark, and a motivation I cannot supply. I've set those explanations aside, and I've tried to sit with the remaining question, which is what it means that 4 leather shoes from a century ago were sitting dry on a wet rock on a May morning beside a creek in the Cherokee National Forest, laced and tied by small hands, facing the water, in a campground that occupies land where families had camped beside the same creek 100 years before. I don't know what it means. I know what it looked like. It looked like 2 children had stood at the water's edge and stepped out of their shoes and walked into the creek, which in May in the Tennessee mountains runs cold and fast and would be to the knee of a 7-year-old within a step or 2 of the bank. It looked like that, and the shoes were dry, and there were no children in the campground, and the ranger who took the original report has no record of it in the system. Darla doesn't talk about it. I've brought it up twice, and both times she's changed the subject with a deliberateness that tells me she's thought about it more than she's willing to discuss. Petra and Curtis broke up several months after the trip, for reasons unrelated to what happened at the campground, and I've lost contact with them both. I'm the only one who seems to need to keep examining it, turning it over, checking it against new information that never arrives. The creek is still there. The campground is still operating. I've checked the reservation system, and it's bookable through the fall. The flat rocks at the water's edge are presumably still there, still catching the morning light off the current the way I remember them catching it in the last evening light before the rain came. I made the reservation once because I remembered the place as beautiful, and it was beautiful, and the beauty of it, and what happened there the second morning, have become so thoroughly intertwined in my memory that I can't recover the former without the latter arriving with it. I haven't gone back. I don't think I will. Not because I'm afraid of what I might find, though that's part of it, but because I'm afraid of what I might not find, which is anything at all. Because anything at all would be easier to carry than the specific absence I've been carrying since a May morning when my friend called from the direction of the creek, and I pushed through the rhododendron and came out on the bank and found 4 leather shoes sitting dry on a wet rock in the Talion. Rain-cleared morning, laced and tied, facing the water, waiting with the patience of things that have been waiting for a very long time. The Lynville Gorge wilderness is the kind of place that has a reputation among people who know it, and an absence of reputation among people who don't, which is part of what makes it what it is. It sits in the Pisgah National Forest, in the North Carolina mountains, a steep-walled river gorge that drops several hundred feet from the surrounding plateau, and holds within it a quality of isolation that is genuinely unusual for a wilderness area in the eastern United States. Not the managed isolation of a designated backcountry zone with permit limits and maintained trails, but the older, denser isolation of terrain that resists easy travel and rewards the people who are willing to work for it with the particular silence of a place that most people don't reach. The trails in and around the gorge are unmaintained in the strict sense, more routes than trails, requiring navigation and route finding and a tolerance for difficult terrain that filters the user population down to people who know what they're doing. My friend Joel had been going there for years. He'd introduced me to the gorge the previous fall, and I'd been back twice since. And when he called me in late September to say he was planning a weekend trip and did I want to bring someone, I called my friend Marcus, and the 3 of us made arrangements for a Friday through Sunday. The primitive camping area we'd chosen was on the rim of the gorge, a loop road accessible by permit from the Forest Service office, with 8 designated sites spread along the loop at intervals of 100 yards or so. The sites were primitive in the real sense, no hookups, no bear boxes, no platforms, just a cleared area with a fire ring of stacked stone and usually a picnic table and a bear hang established by previous campers in the surrounding trees. The permit system for this area was low friction. You registered at a self-service station, noted your site number, paid a small fee, and that was the extent of the administrative apparatus. The camp host was a seasonal volunteer, a man in his 60s named Ferris, who managed the area from a small camper van he kept at the loop entrance, and who kept a register of who was in which site and maintained basic oversight of the area. We arrived at 4 on a Friday afternoon and found Ferris in a camp chair outside his van reading a magazine. He checked our permit and told us the loop was empty, all 8 sites vacant. We could have our pick. He said a group had been in over the previous weekend, but had cleared out by Sunday and no one had come in since. He said the weather looked good through Sunday, and that the gorge access trail from Site 2 was in reasonable shape if we wanted to go down. We told him we'd probably stay on the rim this trip and do some day hiking. He nodded and went back to his magazine, and we drove the loop to find Site 3, which Joel had used before and liked for its view south along the rim. While Marcus and Joel set up the tents, I walked the loop to get a sense of the other sites. This is something I do habitually when I'm in a new area, a circuit of the surroundings before dark, understanding the layout, noting the access points, establishing a mental map of the space I'll be occupying. The loop was maybe a mile around, the sites numbered sequentially, each one visible from the loop road with the forest behind it rising toward the gorge rim in one direction and dropping away in the other. The afternoon light was going flat and golden in the way of late September at elevation, the hardwoods just beginning their turn, the air carrying the first real cold of the approaching season. I noticed the first site at Site 1, which was the first one I reached after leaving our own. The fire ring had been rearranged. Not dismantled, the stones were all present. The ring was intact as a structure, but the stones had been moved. The largest stones, which in a fire ring are typically placed around the perimeter for stability and heat reflection, had been repositioned. Some of them turned to expose their flat faces inward. Some of them moved to create gaps in the perimeter that hadn't been there by design. And the ash in the ring had been disturbed, not scattered, not removed, but spread flat and searched through, the way you'd search through ash if you were looking for something in it or reading something in the pattern of what remained. The disturbance had a purposeful quality. It wasn't the mess of wind or rain moving through the ring. It was the evidence of hands working through the contents of the ring with intention. I stood there looking at it, and then kept going to Site 2. Same pattern. Fire ring rearranged. Ash spread and searched. The large stones repositioned. I crouched at the ring and looked at the ash surface and saw the marks of fingers drawn through it, not uniformly, not randomly, but in a searching pattern, back and forth across different sections of the ash bed, the kind of movement produced by someone looking for something specific. Site 3 was ours, already occupied by our tents and gear, so I continued to Site 4. Same pattern again, and at this site something additional, the bare hang tree, a large hemlock at the edge of the clearing with a high horizontal branch that previous campers had used for food storage, showed bark damage. The bark had been scraped from the trunk at intervals going up, not torn, scraped. The marks of something gripping the bark and pulling downward as it climbed. The scrapes at consistent intervals suggesting the spacing of handholds on the ascent. The branch at hang height had been stripped of smaller side branches on its upper surface, the breakpoints fresh enough to show white wood. Something had climbed that tree and moved out along the food hang branch from above. I kept walking. Sites 5 and 6 showed the same fire ring disturbance, the ash search, the purposeful rearrangement of stones. Site 7 stopped me longer than the others. The picnic table, a standard Forest Service installation, pressure-treated lumber on a frame of 4x4 posts embedded in the ground, weighing perhaps 250 pounds, had been moved. Not overturned, not damaged. Moved, dragged 6 feet from its original position, which I could identify because the post holes were visible in the soil where the legs had sat, and the drag marks were clear, in the soft ground between the original position and the new one. 2 parallel furrows, the width of the table's base, cut through the accumulated duff and into the mineral soil beneath. The marks clean and relatively fresh, no rain filling, no duff settling back over them. The table had been dragged to a new position that gave it a direct sightline to the loop road, facing out toward the road rather than into the site the way tables are typically oriented, as if it had been repositioned to allow someone sitting at it to watch the road. Site 8, the last on the loop before it returned to the entrance, showed the fire ring disturbance and additionally a second bare hang tree with climbing damage. The bark scrapes on this one were higher than on the Site 4 tree, reaching perhaps 20 feet before stopping, and the wood at each scrape point was still pale and slightly resinous, the exposure not yet darkened by oxidation or weathering. I walked back to our site and sat in my camp chair and told Joel and Marcus what I'd found. Joel listened the way he listens to trail reports carefully, without interruption, building a picture. Marcus asked clarifying questions about the picnic table, specifically whether the drag marks could have been made by an animal. I said I'd thought about that. The marks were parallel, and even the width consistent with the table's base. and the table had been moved in a straight line, rather than the irregular displacement you'd expect from an animal pushing or pulling at something. The table had been moved with a purpose that was architectural repositioned to face the road, and that quality of purpose was not consistent with opportunistic animal behavior. Joel said he thought we should keep a fire going all night. I said I thought so too. Marcus, who had a background in wildlife biology and typically served as our voice of reasonable explanation, didn't argue the point. We made a large fire and ate early and established a watch rotation before dark. 3 people, 3 shifts, roughly 2.5 hours each. Joel took the first shift, Marcus the second, and I took the third, which ran from approximately 2:30 to 5 in the morning. I'd slept for 5 hours when Marcus woke me at 2:30, and I came out of my tent into cold, clear air and a fire that he'd built up before waking me so I'd have good light and heat through my watch. He told me the first 2 shifts had been quiet. He said he'd heard the usual night sounds, wind in the canopy, the creek at the gorge bottom far below, some small animal activity in the leaf litter at the clearing's edge, but nothing that had required any decision-making. He said the fire was stocked, and there was wood on the ground beside it for the next hour at least. He went to his tent, and I settled into the chair closest to the fire with my back to it so my eyes could adjust to the dark beyond the firelight. The sounds started at approximately 3 in the morning. They came from the ridge above the loop, the high ground on the gorge side, above and behind the line of campsites. The ridge there was steep and timbered, accessible from the sites but not easily, the kind of terrain you'd navigate slowly even in daylight. What I heard was movement, not the movement of wind in the canopy, which has a continuous and variable quality, and not the movement of small animals in the leaf litter, which is brief and localized. This was the movement of something large, moving at a walking pace, through the trees on the ridge above the loop. I could hear it because the night was still, and the leaf fall of late September meant the forest floor was deep in dry material that registered footsteps clearly. It was moving parallel to the loop road, above the line of sights, working from one end of the loop toward the other. I sat and listened and tracked it by sound across the ridge. It was moving steadily, without pause, covering ground at the pace of a deliberate walk rather than a hurried one. It covered what I estimated as the full length of the loop in approximately 20 minutes, moving from the Site 8 end toward the Site 1 end, and then it paused. I sat very still during the pause, watching the fire and listening. The pause lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then the movement resumed, returning in the direction it had come from, covering the same distance at the same pace, and then going quiet at approximately 3:40 in the morning. I did not wake Joel or Marcus. I've thought about that decision since, and I've arrived at the same place each time, which is that there was nothing to do that waking them would have enabled. The movement on the ridge was not approaching the site. It was not descending toward the loop. It was moving parallel to us, above us, at a distance I estimated as 70 to 100 yards based on the sound. Waking them would have produced 3 people sitting around a fire listening to something that had already finished moving. I sat alone by the fire for the remaining hour and 40 minutes of my watch, and the ridge above me was quiet, and the fire held and nothing else happened. In the morning, we found the bark stripping at the edge of our site. 2 trees, a red maple and a small birch, at the clearing's border closest to the ridge, the side that faced the high ground where the movement had come from. On each tree, at a height of approximately 5 to 5.5 feet from the ground, a section of bark had been removed in long vertical strips, 6 to 8 inches each, the stripping clean and controlled, the exposed cambium beneath pale and damp. The dampness told me the stripping had happened recently within the last several hours because exposed cambium dries and begins to oxidize relatively quickly, and the surface on these was still visibly moist when I held my hand near it in the cool morning air. The stripping had happened during the night, during my watch, during the period when I was sitting at the fire 30 yards away. Something had come to the edge of our clearing and stripped bark from 2 trees at head height while I was awake and present. I had not heard it. Whatever had moved along the ridge above the loop at 3 in the morning had been audible at 70 to 100 yards in still air through dry leaf fall. Whatever had come to the edge of our clearing and stripped bark from 2 trees while I sat at the fire had produced no sound I'd registered. Those 2 facts together implied either 2 different things operating at the same time, or one thing that modulated its sound production intentionally, that had been audible at a distance and silent at close range. I laid those two possibilities out in my mind while I stood looking at the pale, damp wood exposed on the maple and the birch, and I didn't like either of them enough to commit to it. We broke camp after breakfast and drove out the loop to find Ferris at his van. I told him what we'd found at the other sites the previous afternoon, and what we'd heard during the night, and what we'd found at the edge of our site in the morning. He listened with his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the ground between us rather than at me, and when I finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said that the area had had some activity over the past season that the Forest Service was aware of. He said it the way you say something you've said before, something that has become a formulation through repetition. I asked what kind of activity. He said he wasn't the right person to speak to about that the district ranger's office would be the appropriate contact. I asked if he'd noticed anything himself. He looked up from the ground between us and looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation, and said that he kept a good fire going every night, and that he found it helped to face the van toward the loop, rather than away from it. Then he looked back down and took a sip of his coffee. I called the district ranger's office the following week. I was transferred twice before reaching a recreation specialist who was familiar with the Lynville Gorge primitive area and who listened to my account with a patience that felt practiced. When I finished, she asked several specific questions about the fire ring disturbances, and specifically the ash searching, about the picnic table's new position and its sightline to the road, about the bark stripping and the height of the strips. The specificity of those questions told me the same thing the ranger at the Smokies had told me. With her questions about cordage twist and pitch seals, that this framework of evidence was known, that the questions being asked were the questions of someone filling in details on a picture that already had its general shape. She said she'd note my report and pass it to the appropriate team. I asked if there were other reports from this area. She said she wasn't able to speak to that. I asked if the area was considered safe for camping. She said the area was open to permitted camping and that there were no current closures or advisories in place. I asked if she could tell me anything about what the activity was. She said she wasn't able to characterize ongoing assessments. I thanked her and hung up. The picnic table is the detail I find myself examining most often when I let the memory of that weekend fully surface. Not the bark stripping, which is physically dramatic and viscerally unsettling in the way of evidence left at close range. Not the ridge movement, which covered the full length of the loop at a walking pace with a methodical consistency that implied familiarity with the terrain. The picnic table, 250 pounds of pressure-treated lumber and embedded posts dragged 6 feet across soft ground and repositioned to face the road, the drag marks parallel and even and straight, the new orientation deliberate useful for watching the road rather than for using the table as a table. That repositioning implies an assessment of the site, an understanding that the table in its original position served the campers who occupied the site, and that the table in its new position served a different purpose for a different occupant. It implies looking at an object in an environment and understanding how to modify the environment to make the object useful in a different way. That's not instinct. That's not opportunistic animal behavior responding to food smell or territory signal. That's evaluation and modification of the physical environment for a specific purpose, performed on all 8 sites in what felt, from the evidence, like a single systematic circuit, the same pattern of disturbance at each site, the fire ring search, the ash examination, the bare hang inspection, followed by a selective repositioning at the site where a heavy object could be moved to create a useful vantage point. Something had gone through every site in that loop and had examined each one and had made one specific modification to the site where the modification was worth making. Joel has been back to the Lynville Gorge twice since that weekend. Both times he's camped in the gorge itself rather than on the rim, and both times he's reported nothing unusual. He says the rim area has felt different to him since not dangerous, not explicitly wrong, but different in the way a space feels different when you know it has another occupant whose habits and purposes you don't fully understand. He says he's come to think of the rim as a place where someone else lives, and where camping is something you do with an awareness of that, the way you'd be aware of a neighbor you'd never met but whose presence you'd inferred from evidence. He said that framing makes it manageable. I said I understood the framing but wasn't sure I'd arrived at manageable yet. Marcus filed a written report with the Forest Service and received an acknowledgement email and no follow-up. He's characterized the weekend to people who've asked about it as a trip with some unusual wildlife sign which is accurate in the technical sense and functional as a social answer, and leaves out everything that made it what it was. He's a scientist by training, and I think the framing he's settled on is the most defensible one available to him. Unusual wildlife sign, unidentified species, insufficient data for further characterization. I understand that framing too. I just can't make it fit the picnic table. Ferris told me to keep a good fire and to face the van toward the loop rather than away from it. That was his version of useful information, the version that fit the situation as he'd come to understand it, through however many weekends of managing a primitive campground, where all 8 sites showed the same pattern of disturbance after the previous occupants had cleared out. He'd found something that worked: fire, orientation, a way of managing his own presence in a space that had another presence, and he'd passed it along in the only terms that were both honest and practical. I think about the circuit, the methodical quality of it, the same examination performed at each site, the ash in the fire ring searched with what I'd characterize to myself as fingers drawn through it in a looking for something pattern. What were they looking for? What information does ash contain that makes it worth searching through at every site in a loop campground after the occupants have cleared out? I don't know. I've thought about it for months and I don't know, and the not knowing is its own kind of weight, heavier in some ways than if I had an answer I didn't like. An answer I didn't like would at least be an answer. What I have instead is evidence of a purpose I can't reconstruct, systematic and repeated, covering 8 sites in a single circuit, with the patience and thoroughness of something that had been doing this for long enough that the circuit was routine. The wood on those 2 trees at the edge of our clearing was still damp when I found it in the morning. The bark had been stripped while I sat at the fire 30 yards away. I was awake. I was paying attention. The ridge above had gone quiet at 3:40, and I'd been listening for anything else since then, and I'd heard nothing at the edge of the clearing, nothing in the leaf litter between the tree line and where I sat. Whatever had come to those trees had come and worked and gone without producing a sound I could register, and it had left the wood damp and pale, and the clearing exactly as it had been otherwise. The fire burning steadily, the tents undisturbed, the 3 of us present and apparently uninteresting, except as evidence of occupancy, the way a site is interesting after its occupants leave, when the fire ring is full of ash, worth searching, and the hang tree is worth inspecting, and the heavy furniture is worth repositioning. We'd been there, we'd been registered and present, and I'd been awake at the fire. And whatever came to the edge of the clearing had treated our presence the way it treated the evidence of previous campers at the other 7 sites, as information to be assessed, as a condition of the environment to be noted, not as a deterrent or a threat, as something already factored in, as something whose presence changed nothing about the circuit that needed to be made. That's the part that doesn't let go. Not that it came close, that it came close and the closeness didn't change anything about what it was doing. The section I was walking runs through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests in Virginia, a stretch of the Appalachian Trail that I'd been planning to complete in segments over several years. This was my 3rd segment on this section, 11 days carrying a full resupply out of a trail town I'd reached on day 4. The kind of trip that finds its own rhythm by the 3rd day and becomes, by the 6th, less like an event and more like a state of being, the body adapting to the mileage and the weight, the mind settling into the reduced bandwidth of a life organized entirely around weather and water and where you'll sleep. I've done enough long-distance hiking to know that rhythm and to value it, and by the 6th day of this segment I was deep in it, moving well, sleeping hard, thinking in the compressed practical terms of someone whose world has narrowed to what fits in a 40-liter pack and what can be resolved before dark. The dispersed site I chose for the 6th night was half a mile off the main trail, on a side path I'd found on my first pass through this section 2 years earlier. It sat in a small clearing beside a seasonal creek, not a named creek, just one of the dozens of unnamed drainages that cross the AT corridor in that part of Virginia, feeding down from the ridge system into the valley below. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across, flat and soft-floored, the kind of site that forms naturally, where the trees thin around a water source and the ground has been used enough to stay clear without being used enough to show heavy impact. I'd camped there once before and found it exactly what I needed. Private, quiet, water close, no indication that anyone else was using it regularly. I'd noted its location on my topo and carried it forward as a known quantity, a place I could trust. I arrived at the site around 5 in the afternoon of the 6th day with enough daylight to set up comfortably. The clearing was as I remembered it. I pitched the tent on the flattest section of ground, staked it out properly, including the vestibule, and hung my food bag from a branch I'd used the previous time, a white oak, with a good horizontal limb 15 feet up, far enough from the trunk and high enough to be functional. I organized the tent interior the way I always do. Sleeping pad flat, sleeping bag unrolled on top of it, clothes bag at the foot, pack against the far wall with the hip belt loosened, and the top pocket accessible. My journal I'd been writing in that morning and left open to the previous night's entry. I have a habit of leaving it open to the current page, so I can add to it during the day if something occurs to me, and I'd set it on top of the sleeping bag when I came in and dropped my pack. I zipped the tent. Both zippers, the main door zipper running from the bottom right corner up and over the top and back down to the bottom left, meeting in the middle at the top. I do this habitually, fully zip the tent when I leave it, regardless of how briefly, because the alternative is insects, and the insects in Virginia in September include things I don't want in my sleeping bag. I zipped it completely, both pulls meeting at the top, and I picked up my water filter and my 2 soft flasks and walked to the creek. The creek was perhaps 50 yards from the tent, across the clearing, and through a short strip of vegetation at the clearing's far edge. Filtering water takes me about 8 minutes for 2 liters on the filter. I was carrying a squeeze filter that requires filling the dirty bag, attaching the filter, and squeezing into the clean flask, which you do twice for 2 liters. I filled both flasks and spent another minute or 2 crouched at the creek looking at the water, which was clear and moving well, and then I stood and walked back across the clearing to the tent. The door was unzipped to the midpoint, not all the way, not partially, in the irregular way of a zipper that has caught or slipped. To the midpoint, precisely, both pulls separated and drawn to the halfway point of their respective tracks, leaving a triangular opening at the top of the door large enough to see into the tent interior and large enough to reach through comfortably. The fabric of the door panel had been folded back on itself along the opening's edge, the fold crisp and deliberate, the kind of fold you make when you want to hold the opening in place and look inside without the door panel obscuring your view. It was not the configuration of a zipper that had come undone. It was the configuration of a door that had been opened by someone who wanted to see inside and had folded the panel back to make the seeing easier. I stood outside the tent for a moment looking at it. Then I crouched and looked through the opening without touching it. The interior was visible in the filtered afternoon light sleeping pad, sleeping bag unrolled on top of it, clothes bag at the foot, pack against the far wall. Everything appeared to be in the positions I'd left them. I unzipped the door fully and went inside. My pack was untouched. The contents were as I'd packed them, the top pocket accessible and closed, the main compartment closed, the hip belt loosened on the ground where I'd placed it. My sleeping bag was in the position I'd left it, unrolled and flat. The clothes bag at the foot was undisturbed. There was no smell that didn't belong, no animal smell, no food smell from anything that had been brought in and removed. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been disturbed. The journal was on the ground just outside the tent door, on the left side of the vestibule area, open to the same page it had been open to when I'd left it on top of the sleeping bag, open to the previous night's entry, as I'd left it, but on the ground outside the tent rather than on the sleeping bag inside, placed with its spine flat and its pages open, set down rather than dropped, the pages lying flat, and even rather than crumpled or bent, the way a book lies when it's been set down deliberately on a flat surface rather than fallen or tossed. Between where I'd left it on the sleeping bag and where it was now on the ground outside the door, something had picked it up, carried it through the unzipped door panel, and set it down in the vestibule area, open to the same page. Facing up, I sat outside the tent on the ground and looked at the journal and tried to think clearly about what I was looking at. 12 minutes. I had been gone for 12 minutes, by the count I'd been keeping in my head, and I had zipped the tent fully before leaving. In 12 minutes, something had unzipped the door to the midpoint with sufficient precision and care to fold the door panel back neatly, had looked inside or entered the tent, had taken my journal from the sleeping bag, had carried it to the vestibule, and placed it on the ground open to the page it had been open to, had not touched anything else, and had gone. In 12 minutes, in full afternoon daylight, in a clearing 50 yards from where I'd been crouching at the creek. I did not hear anything. The creek makes noise. The white noise of moving water over rock, which masks some ambient sound. But it was 50 yards away, and I'd been paying the kind of attention I always pay when I'm alone in the backcountry. The low-level environmental awareness that's become automatic after enough time in these places. I'd heard nothing from the direction of the tent. No branch movement, no footfall, no sound of the zipper. 50 yards in September forest, with dry leaf fall on the ground, should have produced audible footsteps at that distance, in still air. I had heard nothing. I picked up the journal and looked at the page it was open to. The previous night's entry. 2 paragraphs about the day's miles, and the quality of the light in the afternoon, and a note about a raven I'd watched working an updraft above the ridge for several minutes. Nothing in the entry that meant anything to anyone who hadn't been with me on the trail that day. I looked at the page for a long time, trying to understand why this page specifically, and the only answer I could construct was that it was the page the journal had been open to when it had been picked up, that the choice of page was not a choice but a fact, the journal having been taken as it was and replaced as it was, open to the page that happened to be showing. That reading offered less than the alternative, which was that the page had been looked at and that what was on the page had been of interest, and the journal had been set outside the tent as a form of communication whose content I couldn't decode. I sat with those 2 possibilities for the remaining daylight. I set up my trekking poles across the tent door in the configuration I've used before as a basic alarm poles laid horizontally across the door opening, at knee height, threaded through the guy line attachment points on either side, so that anything opening the door from outside would contact the poles and produce noise. I ate cold food from my pack rather than cooking, because cooking produces smell, and I decided not to produce more environmental information than I already had. I went into the tent at dark, with my knife unsheathed in my right hand, and lay on top of my sleeping bag, fully dressed with my headlamp on my forehead, set to red, and the journal beside me, and tried to think about what the appropriate response to the situation was. The appropriate response was probably to pack up and walk out in the dark, or to walk the half-mile back to the main trail and flag the first shelter I could reach. I thought about that response for a while, and then I thought about the 12 miles to the nearest road, and the fact that I was carrying an 11-day food load, and that the terrain between me and any real exit point was not terrain. Wanted to navigate in the dark without a specific, compelling reason to do so. I constructed a hierarchy of threat based on what I knew. Something had opened my tent and moved my journal, and touched nothing else, and made no sound, and been gone, before I returned from a 12-minute water filter trip. That was the full extent of the threat inventory. Nothing aggressive, nothing designed to harm or drive off. Something curious, or something communicating, or something that had wanted to look inside and had done so and had left. I stayed. I held my knife and watched the tent ceiling and listened. I went to sleep. I know this because there was a gap in my awareness, a period of time that had no content, the specific blank of genuine sleep rather than the restless non-sleep of lying awake in a dark tent. I woke at some point in the pre-dawn, 4 or 5 in the morning, based on the quality of the dark through the tent fabric, and lay still for a moment, taking inventory of sounds. The creek, wind low in the canopy, the tent fabric moving slightly, nothing that required action. I held my knife and let my eyes adjust, and then I moved the headlamp to my forehead and turned it to low. The tent was still zipped. I looked at the door for a long time in the low red light. Both zipper pulls at the top of the door, meeting where I'd zipped them when I'd gone to sleep. The door panel intact and closed. I turned off the headlamp and lay in the dark until the sky began to change, and then I turned it back on and unzipped the door from inside. The trekking poles were no longer across the door opening. They were leaning against a tree, 8 feet to the left of the tent door, leaning, not lying on the ground where they'd fall if pushed aside, but placed upright against the tree trunk, side by side, in the position you'd put poles when you're setting them aside carefully rather than dropping them. The tent had been open from outside during the night. The poles moved from the door opening and placed against the tree, and the tent rezipped from outside. All of this had happened while I was asleep 6 feet away. All of it had happened without waking me. I packed the tent in under 10 minutes, and I was on the trail before full light. I didn't run. I moved at the pace of someone who has made a decision and is executing it and doesn't need to be frantic about it. I covered the half-mile back to the main trail, and then kept going south at the best pace I could sustain with a full pack, and I didn't stop walking at a purposeful pace until I'd covered 6 miles and reached a shelter where 2 other hikers were breaking down their camps. I sat at the picnic table outside the shelter and ate and drank and let my heart rate return to something normal. I've gone over the mechanics of the tent zipper many times since. The zipper on the tent I was using is a standard coil zipper with 2 sliders, designed to be operated from either side, the inside or the outside, by gripping the slider pull and moving it along the track. From the outside, closing a fully open door means bringing both sliders up from the bottom corners to meet at the top. From the inside, the same motion in reverse. The operation requires hands capable of gripping a small pull tab and moving it along a track in a controlled direction, which is a specific motor capability. What had come to my tent in the night had that capability. Had applied it once to remove the trekking poles from the door opening without contact that would have disturbed the poles dramatically enough to wake me. Had applied it again to open the door, had entered or reached in and done whatever it came to do, and had applied it a 3rd time to close the door from outside before leaving. I have not been back to dispersed camping alone since that trip. I've hiked with partners since day hikes, weekend trips with Joel or Marcus, or others, and I've stayed in shelters on a solo section. I completed the following year, always in the shelter structures rather than tenting. The reason I give when people ask is that I prefer shelters for solo trips now, which is true as far as it goes. The reason behind the reason is that I've had 11 months to think about the tent zipper and the trekking poles leaning against the tree, and I haven't been able to arrive at anything I'm comfortable enough with to go back to a dispersed site alone at night. The journal entry for that section of trail ends with a note about the raven and 2 paragraphs about the day's miles and the light. I haven't written in the journal since. I've bought 2 others and started neither of them. There's something about the knowledge that the journal was picked up and carried and set down on an open page that makes the act of writing in one feel different than it did before. Not impossible, not forbidden, but different in a way I haven't fully articulated even to myself. As if the private nature of the act has been qualified. As if the page I was on when I left the tent was read by something that understood what reading was, and the understanding was there before I knew anyone else was in that clearing. That's the part. Not the zipper, not the poles, not the 12 minutes or the full night, the page. Open to the same page, set down facing up outside the tent door, in the position of something that has been read and set aside. My handwriting on the page describing a raven working an updraft above a Virginia ridge and a quality of afternoon light and the previous day's miles. Set outside on the ground as if to say, I saw this. Or, I know you were here. Or nothing at all. No message. Just the fact of having been picked up and carried and placed, which is its own kind of communication regardless of intent. I don't know which of those it was. I haven't found a way to know, and I've stopped expecting to find one. What I have instead is the image that surfaces when I'm almost asleep some nights. The tent in the clearing, zipped, the afternoon light going flat and golden. The journal on the ground outside the door open to the page it was on when someone picked it up. The clearing empty and quiet. The creek running 50 yards away in the trees. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me and has been my primary camping partner since I was old enough to carry a real pack, which in our family meant 12 years old and no complaining about the weight. We grew up in western North Carolina and learned the mountains the way you learn them when you grow up in them, not as destinations but as terrain, as the background against which ordinary life occurs. The ridgelines visible from the school bus and the creek, sounds audible from bedroom windows, and the specific smell of elevation change, as familiar as any domestic smell from childhood. We've been camping together for over 20 years, and we have the shorthand that comes from that, a shared vocabulary of situations and responses, an understanding of each other's tolerances and thresholds, a trust in each other's read of an environment that I've come to rely on, the way you rely on a second set of eyes that you know are calibrated to the same standard as your own. I tell you this because what happened on the second morning of our trip to the Nantahala was witnessed by both of us simultaneously, and we have compared our accounts of it many times since, and they are identical in every particular. I want that established before anything else. This is not one person's experience of something ambiguous. This is 2 people standing in a tent door in the pre-dawn dark, looking at the same thing at the same time, and arriving at the same description of it independently. Whatever it was, we both saw it, Whatever it means, we've been sitting with the same version of it for the same amount of time. We'd gone into the Nantahala on a Thursday in early October, a long weekend trip we'd been planning since July. The site we'd chosen was a primitive site in a section of the forest that Daniel had researched and identified as low traffic, not on any of the popular routes, accessible by a forest road that required a high-clearance vehicle and about 2 miles of driving that most people wouldn't bother with, terminating at a clearing beside a creek, where previous campers had established a fire ring and a bear hang, and a general sense of a site that was used occasionally and maintained informally by the people who found it. Daniel had been there once before, 3 years earlier, with a different friend, and had described it as exactly the kind of site we both prefer: real distance from roads, real quiet, no neighbors, the particular quality of privacy that comes from being somewhere that requires effort to reach. We arrived in the early afternoon, set up efficiently, and spent the remaining daylight exploring the creek and the ridge above the site, which offered a view south along the valley that was at its best in October light. We made dinner and a fire and talked until the fire settled, and then went to sleep with the specific exhaustion of a first day of elevation gain after weeks of working at sea level. The site was quiet in the way of real quiet: the creek, the wind, the occasional sound of something small in the leaf litter, nothing that required any processing. I slept immediately and deeply. The smell woke me at 5:40 in the morning, approximately 20 minutes before the sky would begin to change. I know the time because I'd worn my watch to bed, which I do on backcountry trips, and I checked it in the same motion as opening my eyes, a habit so ingrained it happens before full waking. The smell was wood smoke, and it was close, and it was coming from the wrong direction. I know the topography of the site well enough now, having replayed it many times, to describe it precisely. Our fire ring was to the south of the tent, downhill slightly toward the creek, positioned by the previous campers who'd established the site in the most logical location, relative to the wind patterns that typically came down the valley from the north. The smoke from our fire, when we'd had it burning the previous evening, had moved south and dispersed down the creek corridor. What I was smelling at 5:40 in the morning was coming from the north, from uphill, from the direction of the ridge rather than the direction of the creek, from the northwest specifically, perhaps 30 or 40 degrees west of due north. I could tell this because the smell was coming through the tent fabric on one side more strongly than the other, and I oriented to it the way you orient to any strong smell in the dark, by moving toward the source before you've consciously decided to move. I unzipped the tent door on the north-facing vestibule side and pushed the panel back and looked northwest up the slope. The fire was burning in a shallow depression in the trees approximately 60 yards from the tent. I could see the glow before I could see the flame, the amber reflection off the trunks of the trees immediately surrounding the depression, the specific quality of firelight on bark that is different from any other light source, warmer and more directional and more alive in its variation. The depression was one I hadn't noticed during our afternoon exploration of the site, but the slope above the site was varied, and the light during our exploration had been coming from the south, which would have put that section of ground in shadow. A shallow depression in a slope is easy to miss at the wrong angle of light. I was looking at it now because there was a fire in it. The fire was small and controlled. Not a campfire built for warmth or cooking, no large fuel, no high flame. A working fire, the kind you maintain at a specific size, for a specific purpose, with the flat, steady burn of carefully managed fuel. It cast enough light to illuminate a radius of perhaps 15 feet around the depression, and no more. A small, contained circle of visibility in the otherwise dark slope. The shape was moving around it. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters, and because I've been asked to describe it many times, and I've tried each time to use only the words that fit what I actually saw, rather than the words that fit what I concluded or feared. The shape was upright, moving on 2 legs, at a height consistent with a person of average to slightly above average stature. It was moving in a circle around the fire, at a consistent radius of perhaps 4 to 5 feet from the fire's edge, at a pace that I can only describe as deliberate, not fast, not slow, but measured in the way of something that has established this pace and maintains it without thinking about it. The movement was continuous. In the time I watched, which was approximately 2 minutes before I woke Daniel, the shape completed what I estimated as 3 full circuits of the fire without stopping, without varying its pace, without altering its radius. It was not tending the fire. It was not gathering fuel or adjusting the arrangement or doing anything that required interaction with the fire itself. It was circling it, orbiting it with the consistency of something that had been doing this for a long time and would continue doing it until something external changed. I put my hand on Daniel's shoulder. He came out of sleep quickly, the way he always does, and I didn't say anything. I tilted my head toward the slope and he looked where I was looking, and we stood side by side in the tent door and watched. He saw the same thing I saw. I know this because we talked about it afterward, first on the drive home and then more carefully over the following weeks. And his description matched mine in every element: the height, the pace, the radius, the continuous circling without interruption. He said, when I asked him what his first impression had been, that it looked like someone who was cold and trying to stay warm by moving. I said that had been my first impression too. But staying warm by moving produces irregular, self-directed movement, stomping, rubbing, the spontaneous gestures of physical discomfort seeking relief. What we were watching was not that. What we were watching was regular and automatic in a way that staying warm isn't, in a way that no voluntary comfort-seeking behavior is. It looked like the movement of something that circles fires the way some people pace, not to accomplish anything, not in response to any immediate stimulus, but because the pacing itself is the thing, because the repeated circuit has become the default state, the thing the body returns to when nothing else is required of it. Neither of us called out. I've thought about that decision many times and I always arrive at the same place, which is that calling out would have been the wrong move regardless of what the shape was. If it was a person in distress, calling out would have startled them on a steep slope in the dark. If it was something else, calling out would have announced our position and our awareness in a way that felt, at that moment, and in retrospect, inadvisable. We stood in the tent door and watched and did not speak above a whisper to each other, and the shape moved around the fire with its patient and habitual orbit, and the fire burned with its controlled and consistent burn, and the sky above the ridge to the east began to show the first gray suggestion of change. The fire went out when the sky began to lighten. Not faded, not diminished, went out. Between one moment and the next, between one circuit of the shape and the beginning of the next, the glow in the depression was simply gone. The slope was dark where it had been lit. The trees that had been reflecting amber light were no longer reflecting anything. I don't know how a fire goes out that completely and that suddenly unless it is extinguished, unless the fuel is smothered or the flame is cut off from oxygen by something placed over it. A natural fire dying produces a period of diminishment, coals going from orange to red to dark in a process that takes minutes. This took no time at all. One circuit and the fire was there. The beginning of the next circuit, and it was not. The shape was gone before we could see well enough to define it. The darkness on the slope persisted for several minutes after the fire went out. The eyes need time to recalibrate after firelight, and the pre-dawn is the darkest period of the night's end. Regardless, by the time the sky had lightened enough that we could make out the general shapes of the trees on the slope, there was nothing moving among them. The depression was visible as a slightly darker area in the slope's surface, but it was still, and the trees around it were still, and the slope above them toward the ridge was still, and nothing was moving in any of it. We got dressed and made coffee from our camp stove and sat outside the tent until it was fully light without discussing what we'd seen. The discussion came later. In the immediate aftermath, we operated in the particular silence of two people who have seen the same thing and need time before they can talk about it usefully, who understand that premature discussion will produce premature conclusions, and that the thing they're sitting with deserves more patience than that. We drank our coffee and watched the slope become fully visible in the morning light, and saw nothing on it that the morning hadn't put there itself. We went up to the depression that afternoon, on our way back from a day hike along the ridge. It was easier to find than I'd expected. The depression was more distinct in daylight than it had appeared from 60 yards in the dark. A shallow bowl, roughly 8 feet across, pressed into the slope, the soil at its center darker and more compact than the surrounding ground. There was a fire ring of sorts at the center, not the carefully constructed ring of a campsite, not stones selected and placed with intention, but a cleared area where fires had been made repeatedly. The soil blackened at the center, and the ground around it cleared of fuel down to bare earth, in a radius consistent with repeated firekeeping, rather than single-event use. Daniel crouched at the edge of the depression and held his hand over the ash at the center without touching it. He held it there for a moment and then looked at me. The ash was warm. It was mid-afternoon, perhaps 3 o'clock, and the depression was shaded. The trees around it were dense enough that it received no direct sun at any point in the day, which I could tell from the absence of sun-bleached patches on the ground and the quality of the soil, which was the dark consistency of perpetually shaded ground. The ash had not been warmed by sunlight. The fire had gone out at approximately 5:50 in the morning. The ash was still warm 9 hours later. The track was what held us longer than the ash. Around the depression, at a radius of 4 to 5 feet from the fire ring's edge, the ground had been worn into a smooth track approximately 6 inches wide. Not a path in the directional sense. It went nowhere, led nowhere, connected nothing to nothing. A circuit. The leaf litter and duff had been worn away along the circuit's line down to the mineral soil beneath, and the soil surface itself had been compacted to a smoothness that requires sustained repeated pressure over a long period of time. 6 inches wide, which is approximately the width of a consistent footfall pattern, the feet landing in the same positions circuit after circuit until the ground records the repetition. The track was worn deep enough that the compaction was clearly not the work of days or weeks. This was months of use, minimum, and more likely longer. The circuit went around the fire ring at its consistent radius, continuous, no entry point and no exit point, just the worn loop of something that has been walking this circle for long enough that the earth remembers the shape of the walking. We walked back to the site without speaking and broke down the camp without explicitly discussing whether we were leaving that evening rather than the following morning. We loaded the car and drove out the forest road in the late afternoon light, and neither of us said anything until we'd reached the state highway and turned south toward home. What Daniel said first was that the track looked old. He said he'd been thinking about the depth of the compaction and the width of the worn zone, and that both were consistent with use over a period of at least a season, possibly more than one. I said I'd thought the same thing. He said he'd been thinking about what kind of use produces a track like that, whether the circling we'd watched was a nightly thing, something that happened every night or most nights, and if so, what that implied about the relationship between the fire and the circling and the depression and the accumulated use of the site over whatever period of time had worn that track into the ground. I said I'd been thinking about the fire going out when the light changed. He said he'd been thinking about that too. A fire that goes out in the instant when the sky begins to lighten implies a fire that was maintained specifically for the period of darkness and extinguished specifically at its end, not allowed to die naturally, but ended deliberately in response to the changing light. That implies monitoring, awareness of the light level, awareness of the transition from dark to pre-dawn, and the decision or the instinct to extinguish the fire at that transition. Whatever was circling that fire was also watching the sky, was calibrating its activity to the available darkness with a consistency every night, presumably, given the depth of that track that had become as automatic as the circling itself. We have not gone back to that site. Daniel looked it up on the mapping software he uses for trip planning and identified it precisely from the satellite imagery, the clearing, the creek, the road access, the slope above the site. He said the depression was visible in the satellite image, if you knew where to look, a slightly darker patch on the slope in the tree shadow that could be anything, or could be what we know it is. He has not suggested returning. I have not suggested it either. There's an implicit agreement between us that the site belongs to its permanent occupant in a way that our weekend use of it had not displaced, and that what we'd done by camping there was visit a place that was already occupied without knowing it, and that knowing it now changes the calculation of whether to go back. I've thought about the circling more than anything else from that morning. Not the fire, not the track, not the ash warm at 3 in the afternoon. The circling. The specific quality of movement that I described to Daniel as habitual, and that he confirmed matched his own red. The steadiness of a pattern so deeply established that it requires no conscious maintenance, that happens the way breathing happens, the way a person paces a familiar room in a familiar sequence without deciding to. Something had been circling that fire for long enough that the circling had become the default state of being, the thing the body did when nothing else was asked of it. for long enough that the ground beneath the circuit had been worn smooth and compacted, and worn again until the mineral soil showed through. For long enough that the fire management and the sky monitoring and the circuit had all become a single integrated behavior, a nightly practice that ended at the specific moment the darkness did. I don't know what it was. I know what I saw, which was a shape at human height moving at human pace in a consistent orbit around a controlled fire on a slope in the Nantahala National Forest at 5:40 in the morning in early October. I know what Daniel saw, which was the same thing described in the same words when we compared accounts. I know what the ground recorded, which was months or years of that same circuit at that same radius, 6 inches wide, worn to mineral soil. I know the ash was warm at 3 in the afternoon in a shaded depression where no sun reaches, 9 hours after the fire went out. I know we both stood in the tent door and watched for several minutes, and neither of us called out, and that the not calling out was not fear exactly, but something more like recognition. The instinct of two people who have spent enough time in the mountains to know, sometimes, when they are in the presence of something that has been there longer than they have, and that has better reasons for being there than they do. We were visitors. We had been visitors without knowing it, and then we knew it, and then we left. The slope is still there. The depression is still there, visible in the satellite image if you know where to look. October has come and gone since we were there, and October will come again. And whatever practiced that circuit through enough seasons to where the ground's smooth is probably still practicing it, still calibrating to the darkness, still extinguishing the fire at the precise moment the sky begins its change, still moving in its orbit around something that needs to be circled, for reasons that existed before we arrived and will continue long after we don't go back. Petra had been the one to book the site, which meant she'd done the research, and I'd agreed to come along on the strength of her description of the place, a developed campground in a national forest drainage in eastern Tennessee, far enough from the interstate that it didn't attract the weekend overflow traffic, close enough to good hiking that it justified the drive. She'd been there twice before with other friends and had specific reasons for choosing Site 11. It was at the end of the loop, backed against the forest, rather than facing another site, with more separation from the neighboring sites than anything else in the campground, and a small creek audible from the back edge if the water was running. She said it was the kind of site that felt like you'd found it rather than reserved it, which is exactly the quality I look for, and which she knew would be sufficient to get me in the car. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in late September, and found the campground entrance on a forest road off a state highway in a valley I'd never visited before. The drainage was narrow and steep-sided, the forest coming down close to the road on both sides, the campground tucked into a flat section where the valley widened briefly before narrowing again. The host station was at the entrance, a small wooden structure with a self-registration box and a site map under plexiglass, and beside it, the camp host's trailer, a dated but maintained fifth wheel belonging to a man named Aldridge, who came to the door of the trailer when he heard us pull up and checked us in with the efficient friendliness of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The loop was perhaps half full. Friday afternoon in late September puts you ahead of the weekend crowd, but not far enough ahead that you have the place to yourself. And there were families in the middle sites, and a group of older men with a collection of folding chairs and a large cooler near the entrance. Site 11 was at the far end of the loop, as Petra had described, separated from the nearest occupied site by two empty ones, backed against the tree line, with the forest beginning immediately behind the cleared area, and the loop road curving past its front edge. We pulled in and Petra got out first, as she always does, moving to the back of the car to start unloading before I'd turned off the engine. She was standing at the back of the car looking at the tree line when I came around to help with the gear. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was looking at the trees at the back edge of the site, at the point where the cleared area gave way to the forest, and she had the stillness of someone whose attention has been fully captured by something she's trying to resolve. I followed her line of sight and saw the first tree and understood what had stopped her. The bark had been removed from the trunk in a vertical strip at approximately eye level. A clean removal, not torn, not scored, not the rough damage of an animal clawing or rubbing, but taken cleanly from the surface of the trunk in a strip, perhaps 8 inches long and 2 inches wide, the edges of the removal straight and deliberate, the exposed wood beneath dry and slightly grayed. indicating that the removal had happened not recently, but not long ago, either days to a couple of weeks, based on the oxidation and the absence of fresh moisture in the exposed cambium. The strip was positioned at a height of approximately 5 feet from the ground, which is roughly eye level for a standing adult, positioned, I thought, to be seen. At the base of the tree, pressed into the soil at the trunk's base, a cairn. 3 stones stacked with a flat stone on top, the stack level and stable, the stones selected with obvious care for their flatness and their fit against each other. The cairn was not large, perhaps 6 inches high, but it was precise. Someone had taken time with it. Petra pointed without speaking to the second tree. I looked and found the same marking the vertical strip of removed bark at eye level, the cairn at the base, the same deliberate execution. The second tree was perhaps 25 feet from the first, approximately equidistant around the perimeter of the site's back edge. I looked for the third and found it 25 feet further around. Same strip, same cairn, same height, same quality of work. The fourth completed the circuit, equidistant from the third and from the first, 4 trees marking the corners of a rough square that enclosed the entire back portion of the cleared site area. We stood at the back of the car and looked at the 4 trees, and their markings and their cairns and the cleared area they enclosed, and I thought about equidistance and precision and time. The positioning of those 4 trees relative to each other and to the cleared area was not accidental. You don't find 4 trees at the corners of a rough square by chance in a forest of mixed spacing. Either the trees had been chosen specifically for their positions, selected from among many for the geometry they formed, or the geometry had been established over time through use of the site. The marked trees chosen because they already defined the corners of the space, rather than to create corners that didn't exist. Either way, the marking system implied an understanding of the site as a bounded space, a defined area with an interior and an exterior, and 4 reference points that made the boundary legible. I went to find Aldridge. He came back to the site with me and looked at the 4 trees and the cairns and was quiet for a moment, before saying that he hadn't noticed them and that the site had been vacant for approximately 2 weeks, which was consistent with the oxidation I'd estimated on the exposed wood. He said he'd contact the ranger station and have someone come by. He said it in a way that was professionally calm, and that I read as the calm of someone who didn't want to communicate alarm, which is a different thing from the calm of someone who isn't alarmed. The ranger arrived at approximately 6 in the evening, a man named Whitfield who was thorough and unhurried, and who went to each of the 4 trees in turn and photographed the bark removal and the cairns from multiple angles before saying much of anything. He had a small notebook, and he wrote in it at each tree, and at the 4th tree, he crouched down and looked at the cairn from the side and then from above, before standing and looking at the perimeter of marked trees as a whole, which is when I understood that he was assessing the geometry the same way I had understanding it as a system rather than as 4 separate incidents. He told us the markings were consistent with territorial behavior they'd been seeing in this drainage for approximately 18 months. He said it in the specific tone of someone reciting a formulation that had been used before, a prepared characterization that conveyed information while containing it. Territorial behavior, not animal territorial behavior, not bear sign or coyote marking, just territorial behavior, a phrase that applies to any organism that establishes and marks a defined space and that declines to specify which organism is doing the establishing. I asked him what kind of territorial behavior. He said they'd been observing a pattern of site marking in this drainage that had required some assessment. I asked whether the assessment had produced conclusions. He said the situation was ongoing. I asked whether we should be concerned about camping at the site. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the campground was open and operational, and that there were no current advisories in place, and that we should keep our food properly secured and report anything that felt wrong or out of place. He didn't recommend we leave. He didn't recommend we stay. He said to keep food secured and to report anything that felt wrong, which is what rangers say when they've calibrated what they're willing to say very carefully to the minimum that satisfies the obligation to inform without producing a situation they don't want to manage. I've thought about that calibration many times since. The calibration implies knowledge. You can only calibrate how much to say if you know more than you're saying. Whitfield knew more than he told us. The 18 months of observation implied documentation, incident reports, probably a file with photographs not unlike the ones he'd just taken at our site. He'd seen this before, or seen enough like it, that the geometry of 4 bark-stripped trees with cairns at their bases enclosing a campsite was recognizable to him as a category rather than as a novelty. We stayed. The decision was made without extensive discussion. Petra had camped here twice before without incident. The campground was operational, we had food storage equipment and were practiced at using it, and the alternative was a 3-hour drive home in the dark. We made dinner and kept the fire going past the point where we'd normally let it settle, and we sat in our chairs on the fire side of the site, facing away from the marked tree line, and talked about other things with the specific effort of people who've agreed not to talk about the thing they're both thinking about. The fire was good company. A fire in a campsite at night performs a function beyond heat. It provides a visual focus and a sound and a presence that fills some of the space that darkness would otherwise occupy. And the darkness behind us, beyond the marked trees, was the kind of darkness that benefits from being partially displaced. We kept the fire until 10, later than we'd planned, and then banked it and went to our respective tents, and I lay in mine for a while, listening to the campground settle into its nighttime sounds before going to sleep. The movement started at approximately 11:30. I know the time because I'd been lying awake, not anxiously, just in the light wakefulness of a first night in a new place, and had checked my watch perhaps 20 minutes before I first heard it. The sound came from behind the tent, from the direction of the tree line and the 4 marked trees, and it was the sound of movement in the forest footfall and leaf litter, the specific dry rustle and compression of dry leaves underfoot, at a pace and weight consistent with something large moving slowly. It was moving laterally, not approaching, not retreating, but moving parallel to the back edge of the site, from left to right across my sense of its position, at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried. I lay still and listened and tracked it as it moved from what I estimated as the left marked tree toward the right marked tree, the full width of the back edge of the site, and then slowed and stopped. There was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds. Then the movement resumed, returning in the direction it had come from, right to left, the same pace, the same character of sound. It reached what I estimated as the left marked tree again, and paused again, then reversed again, back and forth. The same distance each time, the same pace, the same lateral movement that covered the width of the back edge of the site and turned at approximately the positions of the marked trees. As if the marked trees were endpoints. As if whatever was moving in the tree line understood them as the boundaries of a defined space, and was moving within those boundaries or along them, patrolling them with a consistency that over the course of the next hour produced what felt like a rhythmic and deliberate circuit, back and forth, unhurried and continuous. It never came closer to the tent. The sound remained at the consistent distance of the tree line, perhaps 20 to 25 feet from the back of my tent, and in the hour I lay listening to it, the distance never varied. It was not approaching. It was not building toward anything. It was doing what it was doing, moving back and forth along the back edge of the site between the 2 marked trees at the rear corners with the patience of something that was not trying to produce a result, but was simply occupying its established range. I heard Petra's tent zipper at some point, and then nothing, which meant she'd unzipped and listened and not unzipped further, which I took to mean she'd made the same assessment I'd made. Present, lateral, not approaching, no action indicated. I'd come to the same place. There was nothing to do that responding would have improved. The thing in the tree line was doing what it was doing, and my calling out or turning on a flashlight or opening my tent would have changed the dynamic in ways I couldn't predict and didn't want to initiate. At approximately 12:45, the movement stopped. Not gradually, it was moving, and then it wasn't. The transition between those 2 states as abrupt as anything I've heard in the woods. One pass completed, and then the silence of the tree line, and then nothing more. I lay in the silence for a long time afterward, not sleeping, listening to the campground sounds rebuild themselves in the absence of the other sound. The distant creek, the wind, the sounds of other campers sleeping in the sites around the loop. The forest behind my tent was quiet for the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked the tree line. I did it while Petra made coffee, systematically, at the back edge of the site, from the left marked tree to the right marked tree, and the full length of forest edge in between. I was looking for what the ground would show in daylight, the leaf litter disturbed by the passage of something heavy, the compressed footfall record of an hour of back and forth movement along the back edge of a campsite. The ground showed it. The leaf litter along the back edge of the site had been disturbed in a path approximately 2 feet wide, running from the left marked tree to the right marked tree. Not a single pass of disturbance, but the layered, overlapping disturbance of multiple passes along the same line. The leaves pressed and shifted and rearranged in the specific way of heavy repeated footfall in the same corridor. The path of disturbance began at the left marked tree and ended at the right marked tree. It did not continue beyond either endpoint. It was precisely bounded by the marked trees, as if the back and forth had been constrained to the space between them, as if the trees had described the patrol route as clearly as they described the site perimeter. I looked at the right marked tree from the forest side. The bark removal was on the campsite-facing surface of the trunk, the side visible from within the site, rather than the side visible from within the forest. The cairn at its base was visible from the campsite side. When I looked from the forest side, the flat-top stone oriented toward the site interior. The marking system was designed to be read from inside the site, not from outside it. Whatever had established those markers had placed them to communicate something to the occupants of the site, rather than to mark the territory from the outside looking in. I've thought about that orientation for months, and I haven't arrived at a comfortable conclusion. Territorial marking, as I understand it, as the wildlife biologist context in which Whitfield had placed it, is typically outward-facing, designed to signal to others approaching the territory from outside its boundaries. These markers faced inward. They were designed to be seen by someone already inside the boundary, already occupying the marked space, which suggests a purpose different from standard territorial communication. Not saying to the outside, "This space is mine, stay out." Saying to the inside, "You are inside a marked space. You are within a defined boundary. You are, in whatever sense the marking was meant to convey, known to be here." Petra and I talked about leaving after breakfast. We talked about it seriously and then decided to stay the second night, which I've also thought about many times since, and which I can only explain as the same stubbornness that keeps experienced outdoors people, in places they might reasonably leave. The sense that departure is a concession that means something, that the situation hasn't risen to the level that justifies it, that leaving would be the kind of decision you'd second-guess afterward. We stayed. The second night was quiet, no movement in the tree line, no sound from behind the site. The forest at the back edge of Site 11, as still as any ordinary forest at night. Whatever had been there the first night was either not there the second, or was there more quietly, which is a distinction I've been unable to resolve, and which sits at the back of my mind with the same weight as the first night's sounds. We packed up Sunday morning and checked out with Aldridge, who asked how we'd slept with the specific phrasing of someone who asked that question with a reason. I said we'd heard some activity the first night. He nodded. He asked if I'd be filing a report with the ranger station. I said I would. He said Whitfield would have the contact information if I needed it. He said it the way you say something you've said before to other people who've stayed at Site 11 and had occasion to call Whitfield afterward. I called Whitfield the following week. I described what I'd heard and what I'd found in the morning. The disturbed leaf litter path bounded by the 2 marked trees, its width and character and precision. He listened and asked several questions about the path width and whether it continued beyond the endpoint trees. And when I said it didn't, that it was exactly contained between the marked trees, he was quiet for a moment, and then said that was consistent with what they'd been documenting. I asked what they documented. He said the pattern of behavior in this drainage had been under observation for 18 months, and that his team was continuing to assess it. I asked if the site was going to be closed. He said there were no plans for closure at this time. I asked if other campers at Site 11 had reported similar experiences. He said he wasn't able to speak to other reports specifically. I asked him directly, "What is it?" He was quiet for longer than any of the other silences in the conversation, and then he said that they had not been able to positively identify the species responsible for the territorial marking in this drainage. He said it carefully, with the precision of someone using language that is technically accurate and strategically limited at the same time. Not positively identify. Which means there had been attempts to identify, which means there was evidence sufficient to attempt identification and insufficient to make it positive. Which means there is something in that drainage that has been marking campsites for 18 months, establishing perimeters around occupied sites with bark removal and carefully stacked cairns, patrolling those perimeters at night in the back and forth movement of something that understands the boundaries it has created and which the Forest Service has been unable to name. Site 11 is still in the reservation system. I've checked. It books out most weekends in the fall. The listing says nothing about the markings or the 18 months of documented territorial behavior or the phone calls to Whitfield or what he meant when he said they hadn't been able to positively identify the species. Responsible. People are probably there right now, or will be soon, sleeping in a tent at the back of the site with the 4 marked trees at their corners and the forest behind them, and the particular quality of nighttime quiet that is only quiet until it isn't. I hope they sleep well the first night. I hope they don't lie awake listening to something move back and forth in the leaf litter at the exact distance of the tree line, bounded precisely by the 2 trees at the back corners of the site, back and forth for an hour before it stops, leaving behind in the morning a path of disturbed leaves, 2 feet wide, that begins at one marked tree and ends at the other and does not go anywhere beyond them. I hope, if they find the markings before they unload the car the way Petra found them, that they make a different decision than we did. I'm not sure what decision that would be. I'm not sure leaving was right, and I'm not sure staying was right. And 18 months of documented behavior in a drainage that the Forest Service hasn't been able to characterize suggests that the right decision may not be one of the available options. The territory was marked before we arrived. The patrol of its boundary happened, whether we were there or not, had been happening before we reserved the site, and would happen after we left. We were occupants of a space that already had an occupant, the way you can be a guest in a house and not know until the second night that the house has something in it that was there before you arrived and will be there after you go. The cairns were level and deliberate. Someone had taken time with them. That's what Petra said when she first saw them. And it's what I keep coming back to: the time taken, the care applied, the flat stone selected for the top of each stack and placed with the attention of someone for whom the placing matters. 18 months of marking sites in that drainage with that same care. 18 months of someone taking time. My partner Selah and I had been planning the Pisgah trip for 6 weeks, which for us is a short planning window. We're both methodical about backcountry travel permit research, weather pattern analysis, water source mapping, the kind of preparation that other people find excessive and that we find simply necessary given how much we've invested in not having things go wrong in the woods. Selah has a background in wilderness medicine, and I spent 3 years as a trail crew lead in my 20s. And between us, we carry a body of practical knowledge that makes our trips safer than most, and makes us, I think, somewhat overconfident in our ability to manage whatever a situation produces. I say that now, looking back, because the overconfidence is part of the story. The reason I looked at the first note and spent an afternoon thinking rather than an afternoon packing, the reason we stayed as long as we did. The site was a primitive site in a section of the Pisgah National Forest that isn't covered by the designated backcountry permit system, which means access is self-regulated and the sites aren't maintained beyond whatever stewardship the people who use them choose to provide. This section attracts experienced hikers who know what they're doing and who tend to leave sites better than they find them. A culture of use that produces, over time, sites that are well established and comfortable without being official. The specific site Selah had identified from descriptions in a trail forum was about 4 miles from the trailhead on a route that gained 800 feet in the first 2 miles and then leveled along a ridge before dropping into a cove, where the site sat on flat ground beside a creek. The description mentioned good shelter, reliable water, and a granite boulder formation at the cove's east edge that provided wind protection. It mentioned nothing else. We arrived at the site on a Saturday afternoon in early October, after a 4-hour approach that had been everything. The trail forum had promised, demanding on the ascent and rewarding at the top. The view from the ridge, one of those unobstructed southwest perspectives that make October hiking in the southern Appalachians feel like a privilege you haven't fully earned. The descent into the cove was steep and rooted and required attention, and when we came out into the flat of the site clearing in the early afternoon, I felt the particular satisfaction of a destination reached that looks like it should look, that fulfills the description rather than disappointing it. The site was well established. A fire ring of carefully selected and placed stone, larger than what you'd build for a single use. Clearly the work of accumulated effort by many parties over many seasons. A bare hang established in a hemlock at the clearing's edge, the cord still rigged and functional, the hang height correct. A flat area that had been used as a tent site, often enough that the ground was clear and level. The creek audible from the south end of the clearing, 20 yards through a strip of rhododendron, and at the east edge of the cove, perhaps 40 yards from the fire ring, the granite formation. The forum description had mentioned a large flat slab of granite that had shifted from its original position at some geological point in the past and now leaned against a secondary formation, creating an overhang of perhaps 4 feet at the deepest point, a natural shelter against rain from the west. I found the note while gathering stones to improve the fire ring, which had a gap in the northeast quadrant that would let wind through. I was lifting a flat stone from the ring's edge to reposition it when I saw the plastic bag underneath, pressed against the base of the largest anchor stone. I picked it up. It was a standard sandwich bag, the zip closure type, and inside it was an index card folded in half and then folded again, wrapped in a strip of birch bark that had been tied in place with a length of plant fiber cordage. The wrapping had the quality of something designed to last the bark, protecting the bag from abrasion, the cordage keeping the wrapping tight. Whoever had placed it had expected it to be there for a while. I unwrapped the birch bark and opened the bag and unfolded the index card. The handwriting was in block letters, printed rather than cursive, the kind of writing that prioritizes legibility over speed. The letters were even and consistent, the pressure on the card uniform throughout, the handwriting of someone in a controlled state writing something they'd thought about before they wrote it. Not the hasty scrawl of someone frightened. Not the exaggerated characters of someone performing alarm. Measured, deliberate. It said, "Check under the east-facing boulder before dark. Do not use the trail behind the site after sunset. Leave before Sunday." That was all. No signature, no date, no elaboration. 3 instructions in block letters on an index card, in a plastic bag wrapped in birch bark and pressed under the edge of a fire ring at a primitive site in the Pisgah National Forest. I showed it to Selah. She read it twice, and then looked at the card, and then at me, and said she thought it was someone's idea of a joke. The kind of thing a certain type of hiker plants at backcountry sites to unsettle whoever comes after. A tradition of low-level pranking that exists in trail culture, and that produces exactly this kind of artifact. Specific enough to seem credible, vague enough to be unfalsifiable. She handed the card back to me and went to set up the tent. I looked at the card for another moment, and then folded it back along its creases and put it in my jacket pocket. I thought about it all afternoon. Not obsessively, I set up my section of camp, filtered water, gathered wood, ate a late lunch, did the practical work of establishing ourselves at the site. But the card was present in my thinking the way a persistent background process is present in a computer, running alongside the foreground tasks without interrupting them, consuming some portion of available attention, continuously. The handwriting was what I kept returning to. Selah's read of it as a joke required a person who'd sat down and written 3 careful instructions in even block letters, without any of the stylistic excess that jokes typically include. No spooky language, no exclamation points, no horror movie phraseology, just 3 practical instructions. Check under the boulder, don't use the trail after sunset, leave before Sunday. The specificity and the practicality of it were not the qualities of a joke. They were the qualities of advice. An hour before dark, I walked to the east-facing boulder. The formation was larger than it looked from the fire ring. The main slab, perhaps 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, inclined at approximately 40 degrees from horizontal, where it rested against the secondary formation, the overhang at the deep end just high enough to sit under comfortably. The face of the slab that faced east, the direction indicated by the note, was rough and lichen-covered, unmodified by anything beyond weather. I crouched and looked under the overhang at the deep end. The canvas bundle was pressed against the back wall of the overhang, in the deepest and most protected section, positioned on a natural shelf where the granite formations met at a right angle and created a flat recess, approximately 18 inches wide and a foot deep. The canvas was wrapped tightly around its contents and secured with cordage identical to the cordage on the birch bark, wrapping the same plant fiber, the same twist, The same technique. I unwrapped it carefully, setting the cordage aside, unrolling the canvas on the flat stone beside me. The contents were arranged in the canvas with the same deliberateness that characterized everything else associated with the note. 2 heavy-duty zip ties, the 200-pound rated type used in serious rigging applications, still in their original packaging. A Fox 40 whistle on a lanyard, the kind used in whitewater rescue and wilderness medicine because its sound carries over ambient noise at distances up to a mile. A folded emergency blanket, the heavy-duty foil type, still in its original packaging. A hand-drawn map on heavyweight paper that had been folded to fit the canvas bundle and unfolded with visible care to avoid cracking the folds. A topographic rendering of the surrounding terrain, accurate in its contour lines and drainage patterns, in a way that told me the person who'd drawn it either had professional cartographic training or had spent a great deal of time studying the official topo and reproducing it. 3 locations were marked on the map in red ink, small circles with no labels, positioned at points in the terrain that I could orient to. 1 on the ridge above the cove, 1 in the drainage to the north of the site, 1 in the timber, approximately half a mile east of the clearing, and 1 route highlighted in the same red ink, a line that began at the site and moved east and south across the terrain to a point at the map's eastern edge where a symbol I recognized as a road indicated a forest road. The route was marked with small arrows indicating direction of travel, the arrows consistent and even, the route clear and unambiguous. And a second index card, same stock, same block letters, same even pressure, same measured deliberate hand. It said, "They come to the site from the north. They have been here longer than the Forest Service knows. The map is accurate." That was all. No signature, no date, no elaboration beyond those 3 sentences, which I read 3 times crouched under the granite overhang in the last good light of the October afternoon, the shadows already long in the cove, the temperature dropping with the evening the way it drops fast at elevation in October. I sat under the boulder for a long time with both index cards and the map and the other items arranged on the stone beside me. I was doing what I'd been doing all afternoon, which was thinking, but the thinking had changed character. Before finding the cache, I'd been thinking about the first card in the context of Sela's joke hypothesis, testing it, finding it inadequate, not yet ready to replace it with something else. Now I was thinking about both cards together, and about the cache itself, and about what kind of person prepares a cache like this and leaves it under a boulder at a primitive campsite in the Pisgah National Forest. The cache was not the work of a prankster. A prankster who plants a note under a fire ring does not follow up with a canvas-wrapped bundle containing emergency equipment, a precision map drawn from detailed topographic study, and a second note that specifies the direction from which a threat approaches and asserts a duration of presence that exceeds the Forest Service's knowledge. A prankster does not acquire 200-pound zip ties and a rescue whistle and a heavy-duty emergency blanket and invest them in a joke. The investment in the cache and materials and time and skill was the investment of someone who expected the cache to be used. Someone who had been where I was sitting and had thought carefully about what the person who came after them would need and had assembled those things and left them where they could be found. I carried everything back to the fire ring. Sela was sitting in her camp chair reading, and she looked up when she saw what I was carrying, and I set it all on the flat stone beside the fire ring and sat down across from her and put both index cards on the stone between us and told her to read them again. She read them. Then she looked at the cache items. Then she picked up the map and looked at it for a long time, orienting it to the terrain around us, finding the site, finding the marked locations, finding the highlighted route. She was quiet for most of this. When she put the map down, she said that the contour lines were accurate. She'd studied the topo for this section during trip planning, and the rendering on the hand-drawn map matched the official topo in its elevation, profiles, and drainage patterns. Whoever had drawn it had been working from the official map with sufficient care to reproduce it accurately. She picked up the second index card. She read it again. She set it down. Then she said, "Which direction is north?" I pointed. She looked in that direction at the forest edge on the north side of the clearing, where the cove's flat ground gave way to the slope rising toward the ridge. The tree line was perhaps 30 feet from the edge of the cleared area. Dense second growth with some significant old timber further up, the slope visible for perhaps 50 yards before the timber closed and the terrain became unreadable from where we were sitting. We ate dinner without much conversation. We did not cook with the camp stove. Selah suggested cold food and I agreed without asking why, though I knew the reason was the same as mine, which was that cooking produces smell and smoke, and we had both implicitly decided that producing environmental signals was not what we wanted to do. We ate from our packs and drank cold water and let the fire ring stay cold and sat in the fading light of the cove and looked at the map. The 3 red circles. I oriented to them from the map to the terrain as carefully as I could. The one on the ridge above the cove was above us, and to the north on the ridge we descended to reach the site. The one in the drainage to the north of the site was in the terrain directly behind the north tree line, the direction Selah had looked when I'd pointed north. The one half a mile east in the timber was in the direction we'd have to move initially to reach the highlighted route. I looked at the highlighted route itself. It moved east from the site, crossing the terrain in a line that avoided the 3 marked locations, and then turned south and reached the forest road. The route had been drawn to avoid the red circles. Whoever had drawn it had known where the circles were and had routed around them. We did not sleep. We made that decision without stating it explicitly. When dark came, we were both still sitting at the fire ring, the map between us, and neither of us moved toward the tent. We sat in our chairs and we watched the north tree line and we listened. The night was clear and cold and the stars were visible above the cove in the break in the canopy, and the creek ran to the south with its consistent sound, and the forest on the north edge of the clearing was dark and still. At approximately 11 in the evening, we heard the first sound from the north tree line. I want to be careful about how I describe it because I've been careful about it in every conversation I've had about that night, which is not many because there are not many people I've told the full version to. The sound was movement in the forest on the north side of the clearing. Footfall and leaf litter. The sound of something large moving through the trees, not branches, not wind, not the small rustling of small animals, but the specific compression and displacement of dry October leaves underfoot at the pace and weight of something substantial. It was moving slowly. It was moving toward the clearing. It stopped at the tree line. I know this because the sound of movement stopped and was replaced by the sound of presence, the particular quality of a still forest that has a large still thing in it, a quality that experienced outdoors people develop a sensitivity to, and that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't felt it. Something was at the tree line on the north edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet from where we were sitting, and it was not moving. Selah had her hand on the whistle. I had the map folded to the section showing the highlighted route, and my headlamp in my other hand, set to its lowest setting. We sat without moving and looked at the north tree line, and the north tree line gave back nothing, no shape, no eye shine, no sound of breathing, just the quality of presence in the darkness at the forest edge. After approximately 20 minutes, the presence moved. Not toward us, it moved laterally, to the east along the tree line, the footfall sound resuming and tracking east before going quiet again, then quiet for a long time. Then, perhaps 40 minutes later, sound again from the north, further west than the first position, the same slow movement at the tree line before going still again. We left at 4:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before first light. We packed in the dark, efficiently and quietly, no headlamps until we were in the timber and moving east on the highlighted route. The route was exactly as the map had indicated. The terrain features matched, the drainage crossings matched, the timber density matched. We moved for 2 hours in the dark and the pre-dawn, following the highlighted route around the eastern edge of the red circle in the timber, and reached the forest road at approximately 6:30 as the light was coming fully up. The forest road was exactly where the map said it would be. We walked the forest road south to a trailhead parking area where we'd cached Selah's car as a shuttle vehicle. 3 days earlier, a shuttle we'd set up for a longer planned loop that we'd abandoned when we'd found the note. We drove out to the state highway and kept driving until we'd put an hour between us and the Pisgah, and then stopped at a diner in a small town and sat across from each other at a table by the window and drank coffee until we could talk about it usefully. What we talked about first was the map, the accuracy of it, the care that had produced it, the route that avoided the marked locations. We talked about the cash and the investment it represented, and the difference between the investment and any explanation that involved a joke or a game. We talked about the two index cards and their identical handwriting and the specific information each one contained. The first card logistical, the second contextual, the sequence of them designed to be found in that order. Ring first, boulder second, the logistical instructions preceding the contextual explanation so that you'd have the tools before you understood what they were for. We talked about what they came to the site from the north meant in practice, which was what we'd experienced. Presence at the north tree line, lateral movement along it, the monitoring quality of something that had been there and had stayed, and had eventually moved, but had never come further into the clearing than the tree line itself. The card had said they, not it, not something, they. A word that implies more than one, and that implies personhood, the specific pronoun for a group of people, rather than the indefinite pronoun for an unidentified animal. I've never found out who left the notes. I've searched the trail forums where Sella originally found the site description and found nothing about warnings or caches at that location. I've described the handwriting and the cardstock and the style of the block letters to people who might have been in that section of the Pisgah and found no one who recognized them. Whoever it was, had been there, had stayed, had thought carefully about what the person who came after them would need, had assembled those things with skill and intention, and had left them in the most protected location at the site, with a system of discovery built in the first note, in the most likely place to be found by someone doing ordinary camp maintenance, the second note, and the cache at the location the first note directed you to. They'd been there, they'd experienced what we experienced or something like it. They'd had the foresight and the knowledge to prepare for the next person rather than simply for themselves, which implies a generosity that sits strangely alongside everything else. The notes contained the specificity of the threat, direction, the claim that whatever was there had been there longer than the Forest Service knew, the urgency of leave, before Sunday, delivered in the same measured block letters as everything else. I've been grateful for those notes every day since. I've been grateful for the whistle I didn't have to use, and the zip ties I didn't have to understand the purpose of, and the emergency blanket I didn't have to open, and the map I did have to use, which was accurate to every feature it showed and got us to the forest road in the dark without error. I've been grateful most of all for the route. The specific red ink line that curved east and south around the marked locations and brought us out to pavement while the light was still coming up and the birds were starting. In the timber, and the coffee at the diner was hot enough to hold with both hands while we sat by the window and watched the ordinary morning traffic on the state highway and didn't talk for a while. The site is still out there. The forum description is still up, describing the granite formation and the creek and the established fire ring and the view from the ridge. People are probably still going there, probably still finding the cleared flat area and the functional bear hang and the fire ring with its carefully selected stones. I don't know if the cache is still under the boulder we took the map and left everything else, folded the canvas back over the remaining items, and pressed it into the recess, and moved the cordage back into place as best we could. I don't know if whoever left the notes has been back to check on the cache, to replace items that had been taken, to leave a new note for the next person. I don't know if there will be a next person who finds it in time to use it. I don't know if the previous campers who left it found it in time themselves, or whether they left it afterward, in a condition I don't want to imagine in detail, so that someone else would have what they hadn't. What I know is that they came from the north, that they'd been there longer than anyone in an official capacity knew that the map was accurate, and that somewhere in the Pisgah National Forest, under a granite overhang at a primitive site that trail forums describe without warnings, there may still be a canvas bundle containing a whistle and zip ties, and an emergency blanket, and a hand-drawn map with a route marked in red ink that avoids 3 locations and leads to a forest road 2 miles east. I hope it's still there. I hope the person who finds it reads the first note carefully enough to go looking for the second one. I hope they leave before Sunday. I hope Sunday is still far enough away.